Section 1 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Verla, Viera. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. Pizenous Windies. There was just enough light left in the sky to reveal the bedded herd. The first night shift had gone on. One could see the riders silhouetted against the sky as they rode around the cattle, quieting them with the crooning melodies of Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie and the Trail of 83. The men had finished supper. Some had spread their beds and were lying upon them. They had not yet gone through their short ritual of going to bed. Others sat around the campfire. Red Wallace observed that it was time to hit the hay. As he started to the wagon for his bedroll, he stumbled over a small greasewood bush. A shrill rattle came from underneath. Red jumped back, picking up a stone. "You dirty rascal!" he exclaimed. "Thought you'd bite me, didn't you? Of all the nerve trying to bite me, you cheeky son of a gun. Wanted to bite me? Take that!" The rock struck the snake squarely on the head. "A rattlesnake!" exclaimed Lanky, a tenderfoot of the high school age, whom the boss had taken on the day before, and whom Joe Martin had informally christened Lanky. "I've been wishing all afternoon to see one." "You'll get to see all them you want to see if you stay with this outfit, though they ain't as numerous as they used to be," answered Red. "Are they really as poisonous as they've been reputation of being?" asked Lanky. "Pizenous?" asked Red, seating himself on the bedroll he had just brought from the wagon. "One of them cutthroats took off 3 of the best friends I ever had in this world. You see, it was like this. Poker Bill was out riding fence. He gets down to nail up a loose wire, and one of these reptiles nabs him by the heel. Bill grabs him by the tail and just naturally flails the everlasting stuffing out of him on the fence post. Then Bill takes off his boot and looks at his heel. The fang ain't touched the skin, so he puts back on his boot and goes on his way, thinking nothing of it. About a week afterwards, Bill gets a sore heel. He comes in one day at dinner and tells the boss he can't work that evening, and he lays down on his bunk, and we goes off and leaves him. When we comes in at night, there lays poor Bill, a corpse. He must have known he was going to die, 'cause there on a piece of paper was his will, all wrote out. It says, 'My saddle to Red, my bridle to Pete, and my boots to Ed.' Well, we buries poor Bill, having a swell funeral with a circuit rider to do the preaching. Ed, out of respect to the deceased, wears the boots to the funeral. Pretty soon he gets a sore heel. Bill's boots, he says, are a little too big. They made a blister on my heel. One morning he takes to his bunk, saying he guessed his sock had pizened his heel. That night he breathes his last. Fine man he was, too. They don't make better men than Ed Wilson. Just before he dies, he calls us all to his bedside and says, 'Boys, I'm going to the big roundup. I ain't been as righteous as I ought to have been, but I'm hoping the big range boss will cut me into his herd. Dave, you can have my bridle. Red, you can take my saddle. And Pete, you can have my boots.' Them was the last words he ever spoke. Ed's family asks us to send the corpse back to Virginia, which we does, me going along with it. And I meets Ed's family and tells them what a fine man he was, and how he always done his duty and everything. And fine folks they was, too. When I gets back to the ranch, I find poor Pete all laid out for the undertaker. 'He died of the sore heel,' says the boss, 'just like Bill and Ed. He says give his boots to you.' By this time I was getting suspicious. I takes the boots and examines them close, and there in the spur piece of the left boot is the fang of that dirty, low-down, cutthroat reptile. I takes the pliers and pulls out the fang, and to make sure it don't cause any more devilment, I takes a spade and buries it at the back of the bunkhouse. Then I puts on the boots and wears them right on. This is them I got on now. See that place right there that looks like a pinhole? That's where I pulled the critter's fang out." "I guess it didn't do any more harm," said Lanky. "None to speak of," replied Red. "The boss's old hound dog comes along and sees where I buried the fang, and he forgets but what he'd buried a bone there, and he begins digging like a fool. Pretty soon his paw swells up, and we have to shoot him, but as far as I know, that was the end and the extent of that reptile's devilment." "Well, well," said Hank. "That puts me in mind of a thing that happened to Jess Simpson and me just before I joined this outfit. We was going to a rodeo at Vega in Jess's flivver, and just before we gets to Lubbock, we sees a rattlesnake in the road ahead of us. "Watch me get him," says Jess, and just as the critter raises his head to strike, Jess busts him one right in the mouth with the front tire of his Ford. "One less venomous reptile in the world," says Jess, and we drives on thinking that's all of that. Just as we gets to Lubbock, Jess notices that a tire is nearly down. He pulls up to a little garage in the edge of town and has it fixed, and then we goes on. When we gets to Plainview, we notices that the tire is nearly flat again, so he has it fixed there. Then we goes on to the rodeo, and Jess wins $100 bulldogging, and me 75 goat roping, which we spends and starts home. We gets back to Plainview and stops at the same garage where we had our tire fixed coming up, and we notices a new man changing tires. "Where's the feller that was here last week?" says Jess. "He was so good to us and fixed our tire so good, I thought I'd bring him a little snake medicine," says Jess, sort of winking. "Poor feller, we buried him yesterday," says the man. "His hand all swole up, and he died." "Now ain't that too bad?" says Jess. "Fine man he was. I never seen him till we stopped here last week on our way to Vega, but soon as I looked him in the eye, I says to my pal here, meaning me, 'There's a fine feller.' I'm sort of funny that way," he says. "When I first see a man, I can look him in the eye and tell whether he's any count or not." "Tell his family that two of his true friends lament his death," I says. "I reckon we better be getting on." We drives on, wondering if that dirty reptile did cause the poor feller's death. "We'll stop at Lubbock," says Jess, "and see if the feller there is all right." And so we drives up to the little garage, which is a one-man outfit, and there was a woman running it. "Where is the man that was here last week?" says I. "Oh, my husband," says the woman. "We laid him away last Tuesday," tears coming in her eyes as she spoke. "I'm a poor cowpuncher," said I, "and I spent all my money on the rodeo, but I'll write you a draft on the boss for a month's wages, and it'll be honored, too. You needn't be worried about that." "I'll do the same," says Jess. "You gentlemen are very kind," she says, "but I couldn't accept it. Besides, our home and business is paid for, and there's the insurance money." "How did it happen?" asked Jess. "I guess it was blood pison," she says. "His finger swelled up, and he got sicker and sicker and died. Are you all friends of his?" "That we are," says Jess, "and I want to say right here that there never was a better man than your husband." "No, there wasn't," says I, "and we wish you good luck. We'll have to be getting away." We drives off, overcome with sorrow on account of the death of them two men. Sometimes yet when I'm riding along by myself, I think of them in their graves, and I feel that me and Jess somehow had a hand in it. And I'd just give my hoss and saddle if it hadn't happened. No, sir, Lanky. If you see one of them critters in the road, don't run over him. You might be the innocent means of taking off several lives. The fire had died to a bed of coals. It was no longer possible to see the night herders, but the indistinct songs reached the camp. Lanky was seated on his bedroll. The sitters had dwindled to 4. "I didn't know they were that bad," observed Lanky. "That bad," said Joe Martin. Joe was a veteran of the open range and of the overland trail. Far and near he was known by the name of Windy Joe, but Lanky had not learned of this last fact. "That bad," said Joe again. "Them snakes that Red and Hank told you about must have been baby snakes. They couldn't have been real, he-man, venomous reptiles like the one that killed Ike Morgan. Ike was one of the best friends I ever had in this world. He worked on the yellow house when Red and Hank here was wearing folding breeches. Ike was some cowhand, even if he did have a wooden leg. I reckon I might as well tell you how he got his wooden leg while I'm about it. You see, it was like this. Ike was riding the range one winter day, and as he started up a little canyon, his hoss fell and caught Ike's leg. The critter broke 2 of his own legs in the fall, and there he was on Ike's leg and couldn't get up. And there was poor Ike, wondering if he'd starve before anybody found him. Pretty soon, Ike smelled a norther, and the next thing he knowed, the norther was there, and the next thing he knowed after that, he had icicles on his nose. Ike knowed he'd freeze to death, and that muy pronto if he didn't find some way to get loose. He figured and figured. That was one thing about Ike, he always used his head. Well, he figured and pretty soon he looked around, and he seen an axe about 100 yards off. He 'lowed some nester had been hauling wood out of the canyon and had lost his axe. And mighty glad Ike was of the nester's hard luck, too. And just to show you the nerve of the man, He goes over and gets the axe and chops off his own leg, and he didn't have any chloroform neither, it not being wormy season, and he gets hisself loose and walks 10 miles into headquarters. That's what I call nerve. But what I started out to tell you was how Ike met his death. The boss sent Ike to town and had the blacksmith make him a peg leg. A fine limb it was, too. Ike had him a stirrup made to fit it, and he could ride as good as ever. Many a bronc he peeled after that. He could dance like a fool and hold his own in any shooting match that any tough hombre ever started. Shame it was that he had to be killed by a dirty reptile. Ike was fixing fence in the canyon one evening just at dusk. He needs a stay for the fence, and he looks over in the bushes and see what in the dusk of the evening looks like a pole. He gets down to pick it up, and damn me if it wasn't one of them low-down reptiles, a big specimen with 28 rattles and a button. And the son of a gun nabs Ike by the wooden leg. That don't worry Ike much, and while the critter holds him by the peg, Ike takes out a 6-shooter and sends the gentleman on to his happy hunting ground, cutting off the 28 rattles and the button for a keepsake, which I now have and will show you sometime if you'll make me think of it. Ike gets on his hoss and rides to the bunkhouse where me and Ezra Jenkins are, and when he tries to lift his wooden leg out of the stirrup, it won't come. Ezra and me gets the axe and the cold chisel and cuts off the stirrup from around the peg and brings Ike in the house. By that time the leg is as big as a steer, and it is all we can do to carry him in. Ezra gets his fencing hatchet and me the chopping axe, and we begins to try to reduce Ike's leg to its natural and proper size. We trims, and the leg swells and swells, and the more we trims, the more it swells. However, for the first 10 hours we gains on the swelling, but we begins to tire, and there's nobody to spell us. I takes the axe and keeps Ezra busy packing out the chips and splinters. We works all night, chopping and trimming and packing out, but we gets weaker and weaker, and the swelling keeps gaining on us. Finally, after 3 days, we just naturally gives teetotally out, and has to set down and see poor Ike die. But, said Lanky, a bite on the wooden leg shouldn't have given him any pain. How did it kill him? Well, you see, it was like this, replied Joe. His leg just swelled and swelled till it got so big it just naturally smothered him to death. Fine feller he was, too, one of the best friends I ever had in this world. There was just one good thing about it, added Joe. Ezra and me had enough kindling wood to do us all winter. Joe chunked up the fire and put on the coffee pot. Have a cigarette? Offered Lanky. Roll my own, said Joe, fishing out a shuck. It was Hank's turn. Too bad about Ike, he said, but I don't doubt at all it's so, like you say, for I seen a similar case. Very similar case, except it wasn't a man's leg. Me and Jim Arbery hitched up the hosses one morning and went out to bring in a little stove wood. He headed out towards a little mesquite thicket, and just before we got to it, I seen the lead hoss shy. What's the matter with old Pete? I asked Jim. What's the matter with him? Jim says. My God, man, says he, look at that reptile, big as a fence post. And sure enough, there's a great big rattler holt of the wagon tongue. He'd nabbed it, and he wouldn't let go. Jim knowed exactly what to do. He jumped down and pulled out the coupling pin, letting the doubletree go, and drove the team out of the way. Grab the axe, he says. Well, I jumped out with the axe and begun work. I sure hated to do it, but I knowed it had to be done. I had to chop off the wagon tongue, and be damn quick about it, too, to save the wagon. Them tales of yours and Joe's just made me think how lucky Jack Pearson and me was not to be kilt one time, said Red. The boss sends us out in the winter time to fence a section starve out. We puts up the posts on 3 sides, and then we finds that the boss hasn't figure right, 'cause there ain't none for the other side. We starts to the canyon, thinking we have to cut some and snake 'em out. We gets to the rim rock, and there we sees what looks like a lot of cedar logs. We remarks on our good luck and wonders how the timber got there, but when we drives up close, we finds a bunch of big hibernating reptiles. There was 10,000, I guess. Cuss the luck, says Jack. I thought we'd found our posts. We have, says I, and why ain't we? Them critters are big enough and stiff enough. We'll take 'em along. You're the doctor, says Jack. Well, we gathers up the biggest and the straightest and loads 'em in. We find we don't have to dig post holes. I'd stand one of the critters on his tail, and Jack would drive him in the ground with a 12-pound sledgehammer. We stapled on the wire and told the boss to come out and inspect the job. "Boys," he says, "you do have a brain, leastways one between you. You saved at least a week's work. I'll let you go to Kansas City when we ship again." "Was the fence permanent?" asked Lanky. "It was till spring," said Red. "You see, when spring come, them reptiles just naturally thawed out and come to, and crawled off with a whole mile of wire. Good 6-wire fence we had made, too, hog-tight, horse-high, and bull-strong." "Is it true," asked Lanky, "that rattlesnakes and king snakes are natural enemies and fight each other?" "I don't know about that," said Joe, "but I'll tell you what I seen once. Strange thing it was, too. I came upon a king snake and a rattlesnake one time fighting for dear life. Each one would grab the other and then stick his head under his belly for protection. Finally, just at the same time, they nabbed each other by the tail and begun swallering. There they was, just like a ring, and they swallered and swallered, and the ring got littler and littler. Just then I heard a panther yell, and I looked up just a minute, just a fraction, and when I looked again, damn me if them snakes wasn't gone. I looked for 'em, I reckon, an hour, and it was right out on the open prairie where there wasn't any holes or rocks, and I never could find them critters." "Now, most rattlers," said Red, "is just like bad men. They're just naturally mean, or bite you when you ain't looking, no matter how kind you are to them. You'll find one once in a while, however, that's a purty decent sort of chap. I recollect one in particular, which was a gentlemanly critter." "You're the first man I ever heard speak a good word for a rattlesnake," said Lanky. "I couldn't make no complaint about the conduct and behavior of this particular rattlesnake," said Red. "He treated me decent enough." "What did he do?" asked Lanky. "Well," said Red, "I was fishing one time out on the Pecos, and I run out of bait. What I wanted was a frog, and I looked and looked for nearly an hour and couldn't find none. Finally, I seen a rattlesnake trying to swaller a big bullfrog. I thinks to myself, well, I'm going to have that frog, even if I get snake bit. You see, I had a bottle of snake medicine in my pocket. Old rock and rye it was. I put my foot on that rattlesnake's tail and took a hold of that frog's hind legs and just naturally extracted him right out of the reptile's mouth. Well, instead of getting ringy and showing fight, like most rattlers would, this here snake just looked so sad and down in the mouth that I couldn't help feeling sorry for the critter. 'Here, old feller, cheer up,' says I, giving him a swig of old rock and rye out of my bottle. He takes a dram and crawls off just as pert as a fresh-cutting hoss. I puts the frog on my hook and sits down to fish. Just as I was about to get a bite, I feels something tapping me on the leg. I looks down, and damn me if there ain't that rattlesnake back with 2 frogs in his mouth. Hank stirred up the coals and put on a mesquite grub. Lanky gave him his cue by asking if rattlesnakes ever got in people's beds. "Occasionally," said Hank. "Occasionally, though they ain't as thick as they used to be. One time I woke up in the night thinking it was about time for me to stand guard. I felt something cold on my chest, and I knowed what it was. I says to myself, 'Now, Hank, keep cool, keep cool.' All the time I was easing my hand back around to the top of my head to get a hold of my 6-gun. I was as careful as I could be, but I reckon the critter got on to what I was doing, for just as I was about to touch the gun, he raised up his head and opened his mouth to strike. Then I let him have a bullet right in the mouth. That was the quickest draw I ever made." "I got in a fix just like that one time," said Joe, "except, fool-like, I didn't have my gun handy." "What'd you do?" asked Lanky. "Well," said Joe, "after thinking it over and seeing there wasn't nothing I could do, I just shut my eyes and went back to sleep, and when I woke up in the morning the critter was gone. Just crawled off on his own free will and accord." "Well," said Red, "that shows what a tenderfoot you was, and Hank, too. If you'd just have put hair rope around your bed before you went to sleep, them snakes wouldn't have come in." "I had read that in stories," said Lanky, "but I didn't know if it were really true." "True as the gospel," said Red. "How does it work?" asked Lanky. "Tickles their bellies," replied Red. "A rattlesnake just can't stand tickling. One fall when we was working, the cook one night didn't make camp till dark. Then we found out he had bedded us in a regular den of reptiles. We made our beds right up, touching each other, and put hair ropes on the ground all around the whole outfit. The next morning we counted 129 rattlesnakes around the beds. They had just naturally tickled their fool selves to death trying to crawl over the rope." "The critters, however, ain't so numerous as they used to be in Pecos Bill's time," said Joe. "That man almost put 'em out of business in his day." "How did he do that?" asked Lanky. "Bill was a very smart and ingenious lad," said Joe. "He was the first man to capture a whiffle-puffle. He was the first man to train prairie dogs to dig post holes, and he was the first man to do a lot of things. Among other things, he invented a way to slay rattlesnakes wholesale. When Bill wanted to capture or exterminate any sort of reptile or bird or beast, he would study the critter's habits and find out what his weakness was. Then he would go off and study, and purty soon he would come back with the way all figured out. Bill always used his head. He put in 2 of the best years of his life studying rattlesnakes. Not that Bill was afraid of them, but one of the critters bit his horse one time, and then he got mad. But he never let on. He just went out and made friends with them, and lived with them, and noticed their habits and their diet and where they liked to live at different times of the year, and all that. Bill discovered that rattlesnakes had rather have mothballs than to eat anything under the sun. A rattlesnake will leave a young and tender rabbit any day for a mothball. Bill found out likewise that a rattlesnake just can't stand chili powder. Those 2 clues give him an idea. First, he took some chili powder and soaked it in nitroglycerin. He rolled this into little pills and coated them with a mothball. Then he took these balls and scattered them around where the reptiles stayed. Well, the critters would come out and find the mothballs and swaller 'em right down, not thinking there might be a catch somewheres. Purty soon the outside coating would melt off, and the chili powder would burn the critters on the inside. This would make 'em mad, and they'd beat their tails against the ground and rocks, which exploded the nitroglycerin and blowed 'em into smithereens. We used to kill 'em that way here on the ranch, but the boss made us quit after one of the critters crawled under a steer and blowed him into atoms." "I think that would be a rather dangerous method," said Lanky. "But what is that whiffle-puffle you mentioned a few minutes ago?" "Oh, you'll learn when you get a little older," replied Joe. "You'd better hit the hay now, Lanky. You stand next guard." Lanky bent down to untie his bedroll. Then he jumped straight into the air. "My God, I'm bitten!" he yelled. "Bring the butcher knife and the coal oil," said Hank, "and heat a branding iron." "'Spect we ought to cut off his hand right now before the pison spreads," said Red. "Where's the axe?" "Now, lad, don't let him buffalo you," said Joe. "You ain't bit at all." "But there's blood on my hand," said Lanky. "See?" "That's a sure sign you ain't bit," said Joe. "That's the snake's blood. See, that's the very snake Red killed." "But he struck me," said Lanky. "Sure he did. Them devilish critters will strike after they have their heads cut off. Reflex, that's what they call it. Dirty trick they played on you." "Well, well," said Red. "The critter's head is gone. Still, I think we better cut his hand off to make sure. Them things is so poisonous the bite might kill him anyway. I seen a man bit just like that one time." "And he never was right in his head again," said Hank. "Which one of you was it?" asked Lanky. End of section 1.
Section 2 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. Speed. On Lanky's second night in the cow camp, there were many allusions to his snake bite. "Now, Lanky, watch out for rattlesnakes and don't get bit again," said Hank. "I hope you'll recover without an operation," said Red, "but I still think we ought to have cut your hand off. No tellin' what might happen. Ought to be on the safe side." "Don't let 'em buffalo you, Lanky. Don't let 'em buffalo you," said Joe. "You ain't such a greenhorn as lots of chaps I've seen. Why, when Red here first come to this outfit, he was so ignorant he didn't know split beans from coffee. He thought you had to have a gun to shoot craps. He thought a dogie was something you built houses out of. He thought a lasso was a girl, and remuda a kind of grass. When the boss got ringy, Red said he was a wrangler. Why, he even thought a cowboy was a bull." "He was nearly as bad as old Borrego Mason's sheep herder," said Hank. "I reckon Joe's told you about him, ain't he, Lanky?" "No?" "Well, a guy comes down from the east and tries to get a job running cattle. He 'lowed he's just graduated from college, Harvard or Yale or some of them big schools up there. Said he'd been a big athlete and played in all sorts of games and run in Bigfoot races and the like. Load he came to Texas to be a big rancher. He said, though, he'd be willing to begin at the bottom and work his way up, and for the time being he'd take a job as a common cowhand. Well, he went to all the outfits in the whole country, and he couldn't get anybody to take him on. Why not? Asked Lanky. Well, it was mostly on account of his lingo. He wouldn't talk United States like other people. He wouldn't ask for a job. He was wanting a position or employment with a future to it. And he wouldn't say wages, but always asked about remuneration and emolument and the like. Some of the bosses didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Some of them said he must be a rustler, and others said they wouldn't hire a damn foreigner until he learned to talk United States, or at least Mexican. And so the poor feller had to hire himself to a damn sheep man. It nearly broke his heart. It makes me sorry for the poor fool every time I think of it. And when old man Mason took him down to the sheep pens and turned out the boregas, and the poor greenhorn seen he was going to have to walk, he just naturally broke down and cried. He told old man Mason that his sweetheart back east had just died and that he'd come out west to get over it. Old man Mason told him the first thing to do was to take them sheep out to graze. He told him to be sure to get 'em back by night, and be damn sure to look after the lambs and get every one of 'em back in the pen. If he didn't, there'd be some tall hell-raising in the camp. Old man Mason went back to his shack and sat in the shade all day. Finally it was might nigh dark, and the herder hadn't come in with the woolies. The old man waited a while longer, and still the herder didn't show up. About 9 o'clock he started out to the pens, about 300 yards from the house, to see if he could see anything of the critters. On the way he met his new sheep herder. "Did you have any trouble with the sheep?" says he. "Not with the sheep," says the herder, "but," he says, "the lambs occasioned me considerable annoyance and perturbation." Well, old man Mason didn't know what the hell he meant, and he didn't want to ask for fear he'd appear ignorant, so went on to the pens to see what was the matter with the lambs. The moon was up, and he could see over the rock fence. The sheep was all huddled in the middle of the pen, and the old man counted 175 jackrabbits running around and butting the fence, doing their damnedest to get out. "I got up considerable speed once myself," said Joe. "Once when I was a good deal younger than I am now, but it wasn't no rabbit that I was chasing, it was a prairie fire." "You mean it was a prairie fire chasing you, don't you?" said Lanky. "Naw," said Joe, "it was just as I was saying. I was chasing the prairie fire. It wasn't the prairie fire chasing me. It was back in the early days one time when I was out hunting cattle on the plains. One day in August, I reckon it was, I follered off some cow tracks and got lost from the outfit. I was out 2 days without nothing to eat. Finally, I come on a little herd of buffalo. I shoot a good fat cow and cuts off a piece of tenderloin. Well, when I begins to look around for something to cook it with, not a thing can I find. There ain't a stick of timber, not a twig, nor a dry buffalo chip nowhere around there. I was hungry enough to have that meat raw and bloody, and I needed it too, for I was so hungry that I was weak in the knees. But somehow I never was much of a raw meat eater. It ain't civilized. Well, as I was saying, I couldn't find no regular fuel, so I calculated I'd try the prairie grass, which was long and curly and dry. I gathers up a big pile, puts the hunk of meat on my ramrod, and holds it over the grass and lights a match. Just one flash and the fire's all gone, except the wind comes up all at once and sets the dang prairie on fire. Well, sir, I take out after that prairie fire, holding my meat over the blaze. It would burn along purty regular for a while, then all of a sudden it would give a big jump and tear out across the plains like hell after a wild woman, and I'd have to do my dangest to keep up with it. Well, I chased that prairie fire about 3 hours, I reckon, but I finally got my meat cooked. I ate it, and it sure did taste good, too, and started back across the burnt country to where I had shot the buffalo. Damn me if I hadn't run so far in 3 hours that it took me 2 days to get back. There my hoss was waiting for me, and I found the outfit the next day. "Yeah, that was purty good running," said Red, "but you nor the feller Hank was a-tellin' about either wasn't as swift as one of them college chaps we had on an outfit where I worked once. Not near so swift. Been a good thing for him if he hadn't been so fast. Too swift for his own good." "How was that?" asked Lanky. "Here's the way it was," said Red. "He was a greenhorn, but he was a-learnin' fast. Would have made a good cowhand, poor feller. He got to be a purty good shot with a Winchester and 6-shooter, both, and he was always practicing on rabbits and coyotes and prairie dogs and things. Then he decided he'd have a lot of critters mounted and send 'em back to his folks. Well, he gets everything he wants but a prairie dog, but he just can't get a holt of them critters." "Are they hard to hit?" asked Lanky. "Oh, he could hit 'em all right. He got so he could plug 'em right in the eye, but they always jumped in their holes and got away. They'll do it every time, Lanky. They'll do it every time. Why, one day he took his .45 Winchester and shot one of the critters clean in two, but the front end grabbed the hind end and run down the hole with it before he could get there. Well, he asked the boss if there was any way he could get one, and the boss told him to take good aim, and just as soon as he pulled the trigger to run just as fast as he could, and maybe he'd get there in time to grab the critter before he got away. Well, he goes out and finds a prairie dog a-settin' on his hole, a-barkin' in the sun. He pulls out a six-shooter and takes good aim at the critter's eye, and just as soon as he pulls the trigger, he runs to beat hell, just like the boss told him to. He got there in time all right and bent down to grab the prairie dog, but just as he touched it, the bullet hit him in the back just below the left shoulder blade. When we found him that evening, he was crippled so bad we had to shoot him. Too bad, too, for he had the makings of a first-class cowhand. Yeah, said Joe, them guys you all been telling about was mighty swift, but you don't have to go back east to find speed. Why, I've seen an old cowhand that growed up right here in Texas that could have beat any of them eastern fellers. Tell you what I saw once. One day after the spring work was over, a bunch of us decided to have a baseball game. Well, we chose up, but we liked one man having enough men for two teams. What we gonna do, says I. I guess we'll have to get along with two fielders on our side. Pete Dawson spoke up and says, all you men get in the field and I'll pitch and catch both. And damn me if that's not what he done. He got on the pitcher's box, which was a prairie dog hole, and he'd throw a ball so it whistled like a bullet, and then he'd run in a half circle and get behind the batter and catch it. Not a batter ever touched the ball. It was just 3 up and 3 down with them, and there wasn't nothing for the rest of us to do. When it was Pete's bat, he'd just knock a slow grounder out towards first, and he'd make a home run before the first baseman could get a hold of the ball. We beat him 96-0. One time Pete was with us when we was moving a bunch of wild Mexico steers. One night the fool brute stampeded. We all just on our hosses tried to turn 'em and get 'em to millin'. We had all good hosses, especially Pete, who had a fine hoss he'd won lots of money with, but we couldn't get ahead of them steers. They was just too swift for us. Directly Pete jumps off and takes the slicker and six-shooter with him. He circles around, and in no time, after tromping about a half-dozen jackrabbits to death, he's in front of that herd. We all expected to see him get killed, but he just trots along in front of the critters, waving his slicker and firing his six-shooter. After he'd run that way about 10 miles, the herd got to millin', and purty soon they quieted down, and we never had no more trouble with 'em. That just naturally took all the pertness and spirit out of them brutes. They was so ashamed of themselves that from then on they was as gentle as a bunch of milk cows. The only thing that hurt Pete was that, when it was over, his nose was bleeding like 6 bits. Got too hot, I s'pose, said Lanky. Nah, said Joe, that wasn't it. The bleedin' was from the outside. He just run so fast the wind just naturally peeled all the hide off his nose, and he had to keep it tied up for about 10 days till he growed some more skin. I bet a hoss and saddle, said Red, that he couldn't have turned off old man Coffee's bull like that. That brute had speed. One time old man Coffee shipped out a trainload of cattle from where he was ranchin' on the Lappin' Flat, and this here bull decides he wants to go with him. They cut him back, and the train pulls out in the night. Well, sir, the next morning them cowpunchers looks out the caboose winder, and there's that bull trotting along by the train, bellerin' and pawin' up the dust and hooking at the telegraph poles as he passes. M'by, he follered that train all the way to Kansas City and had to be shipped back. The fellers started to sell him to the packers just for spite, but they knowed old man Coffee never would get over it if they did. Yeah, I heard of that critter, said Joe. Fact is, I rode 100 miles just to see him once, but I didn't get to. We gets to old man Coffee's place about dinner time, and we goes in and asks if he's home. Naw, he ain't at home right now, says his wife. Get down and look at your saddles, and come in and eat. Where is he this morning, I asks. He left about 9 o'clock, she says. He's going over to Phoenix, said he might go by Roswell. I reckon we won't get to see him, I says. Just unsaddle your hosses, she says. I'll look for him back about an hour by sun, that is, if he don't have no hard luck. Wonder if you could tell us where his fast bull is, I says. We come over to see him. Oh, she says, he'd ridin' the bull. That's how I know he'll get back tonight. I reckon that bull could have outrun a Malamo bird, said Hank. No doubt he could, said Joe. No doubt he could. What is a Malamo bird like? Asked Lanky. But Joe forestalled Hank by saying, Lanky, you didn't get enough sleep last night, what with all this rattlesnake skeer. I seen you noddin' while Hank was a-tellin' about that sheep herder of old man Mason's, though I couldn't blame you much for that. Go to bed, son, and maybe we'll see a Malamo bird tomorrow. End of section 2.
Section 3 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Justin S. Barrett. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. Birds and Beasts. It was Lanky's third night in cow camp. The herd had been bedded, and the first night shift had gone on. Lanky, sore of muscle but extremely contented, sat by the fire with Red Wallace, Hank Williams, and Joe Martin, the men who on the first night had imparted to him the esoteric lore of the rattlesnake, and who on the second night had entertained him with yarns of marvelous speed. Lanky had proved a good listener. He had done his best to appear credulous. He had interrupted seldom, and when he had always followed his cue, and had propounded only the questions that the narrators wanted him to ask. It is not surprising, therefore, that on this night the older men were loaded for him. It was Red Wallace that discharged the first missile. "We was speaking of Millimo birds last night," he observed. "I seen sign today, lots of sign." "That's funny. I done that very same thing," said Hank. "I seen, I reckon, 100 holes where they been feeding." "Do you suppose we're likely to see any of them?" asked Lanky. "Not likely," said Joe. "Not likely. They're mighty scarce these days, mighty scarce. And mighty shy, mighty shy. I ain't seen one in years. You might keep your eye peeled, though. We might happen on one any time. We might. You never can tell." "Yeah, we might," broke in Hank. "Still, we're more likely to hear one than to see one. They've got a way of knowing when somebody's about, though he's a mile off. Yeah, they're mighty hard to see, especially these days. Mighty hard to see." "What sort of bird is the Millimo?" asked Lanky. "What is he like?" "Oh," replied Hank, "he's like a Millimo. There ain't nothing else just like him." "Is he large or small?" asked Lanky. "He's rather large," said Hank, "though not as big as an ostrich, I reckon, though somewhat bigger than a crane, which he somewhat resembles in general make-up and conformation. In the fall, when the rain comes and fills up the lakes like they are now, the critters comes in, or used to, and feeds around the edges of the water. They've got long legs like stilts for wading in the water, a long neck, and a long beak that they uses to bore into the soft ground for the earthworms, which is their principal food and diet. I ain't talking about the little puny earthworms like schoolboys used to fish with. No, sir, the Millimo bird would be ashamed of himself if he ate one of them kind. He digs down into the ground and catches the big fellers. Sure enough He-Man worms that looks like inner tubes. I've seen holes you could hide a hosse's leg in where them critters had been excavating for grub. More than one good cow hoss has had to be shot from stepping in holes that these birds has made. Not to say nothing of the good cow hands that has had their necks broke. But as I was saying about the Millimo bird, he just has a way of knowing where the big worms lives. And when he comes to a place where he knows one of them big fellas is all curled up taking a nap down under the ground, he sticks his bill into the soil and begins to bore and bore, walking around and around. Pretty soon his bill goes out of sight. Then his head, then his neck, clean up to his shoulders. That's the way you can slip up on one of them. If you can catch him in just that stage, maybe you can get sight of him. Well, he bores around a while in the hole he has dug. Then all at once he sits back like a hoss when there's a big steer on the other end of the rope. And you know then he's got a hold of one of them big worms. The more he pulls, the more the worm stretches. If he lets up the least bit, the worm jerks his head and neck back into the hole. I seen one once, bobbing up and down like that for 2 hours and 15 minutes before he finally got his worm. Well, he pulls and tussles and yanks and jerks, and finally the worm just can't stand it no longer and has to let go. He shoots out just like a nigger shooter when you turn it loose, and like as not, he hits the Millimo in the eye. But he's a good-natured bird and don't get ringy about it. Just why he does it, I don't know. Maybe he's so glad to get the worm out, or maybe he sees the joke's on him after all. Anyhow, when the worm comes out and hits him in the eye, he just naturally gets tickled and rears back on his hind legs and laughs through his beak so you can hear him a mile or more." "I see," said Lanky. "A strange bird." "But mighty shy," replied Hank. "Mighty shy." "Yeah, they're all shy critters, all right," agreed Joe. "But they ain't near as shy as the whiffle-poofle. Why, them things is so bashful, they don't feel comfortable unless they're hid in the bottom of a bottomless lake." "Are they a fish?" asked Lanky. "Not exactly a fish," explained Joe. "A sort of cross, I reckon, between an eel and a Gila monster." "Are there any around here?" asked Lanky. "Well, maybe," replied Joe. "Maybe a few. Still, I doubt it. You see, right around here the lakes go dry sometimes in the dry season, and the whiffle-poofle wants water, and plenty of it. Mucha agua. Still, there may be a few. Out in the Roswell country, they used to be numerous. Also in Toya Creek and Leon waterholes. I expect, though, they're getting scarce out in them parts now. All game is getting scarce. Still, them critters is mighty hard to catch, and there's just a few that knows how to do it. Mighty few, in fact." "Do people fish for them, then?" asked Lanky. "Some does," replied Joe. "But it ain't no use to fish for 'em with a regular fishing outfit. I've seen them rich dudes from the East come out with their fine tackle, rods, and reels, and all that fool finery, and fish for 'em all day long and never get a nibble. Still, they can be caught." "How does one catch them?" asked Lanky. "So far as I know, it was Pecos Bill that discovered the method. During Pecos Bill's time, there was a lot of people that didn't believe there was any such animal as the whiffle-poofle living in the bottom of the lakes. Bill said he knowed there was, and he'd show 'em. So he studied, and finally he found a way to capture the critters. First, he gets together a rowboat, a long post-hole auger, and a can of oil. Then he hunts up the funniest storyteller he can find and takes him along and sets out. He rows out on the lake to where the water's deep. Then he takes a post-hole auger and bores a hole clean down to the bottom, so as the whiffle-poofle can come up to the top. Then he has the storyteller tell the funniest stories he can think of, all about Pat and Mike and an Englishman and a Scotchman and all that. Pretty soon, the whiffle-poofle gets interested and pricks up his ears. Then Bill tells the storyteller to get funnier. Then pretty soon, the whiffle-poofle is so amused that he comes up through the hole and sticks out his head. Bill tells the man to keep on getting funnier and funnier till the whiffle-poofle comes clean out on top of the water. Then Bill begins to ply the oars very gentle-like at first. The whiffle-poofle is so interested and amused that he just naturally can't help but follow the storyteller, who all the time is getting funnier and funnier. Bill rows faster and faster, all the time making straight for the bank. Just before he gets there, when he's rowing as fast as he can, he pours the oil out on the water and cuts sharply to the left. By that time, the whiffle-poofle has got up so much speed on the slick water that he can't stop, and he just naturally slides right out on the bank. Then Pecos Bill lands on him. If you ever get one of the critters on the land, he's just as helpless as a year-old baby. But they're mighty bashful, mighty bashful. In that particular, they ain't at all like the club-tailed glyptodont, said Red, which is a very ferocious and vicious beast. I can tell you, Lanky, when you are riding around in the canyons and meet one of them fellers, you'd better not get into any disputes with him about your highway rights. Just give him the whole road and don't argue with him. And be careful you don't hang around under the rim rock when them critters is around. I take it they are animals, said Lanky. Yeah, I guess they belong to the kingdom of beasts, replied Red. Some people call 'em whangdoodles, but they ain't real whangdoodles, being much bigger and more ferocious. They're pretty scarce now, but when we work the canyon tomorrow, I can show you places where they have been. Yes, sir, I can show you the very spot where one of them fellers took off one of the very best friends I ever had in this world. A sort of mountain lion, I suppose, said Lanky. Son, one of them babies would make a mountain lion look like a kitten. Besides, they don't belong to the feline species nohow, being more like a kangaroo in build and about 16 hands high when on all fours, though most of the time they hop around on their hind legs and tail and keep their forepaws ready to biff anything that gets in their way. And if one of them critters hits you, well, you're lucky if they find anything to bury. However, that ain't their main method of combat. That ain't the way one of them took off my dear friend. Jack Snodgrass was his name. The Cbteddy has got a big flat tail made out of stuff like cow's horn, except there ain't no bone in it. This tail being springy is a great aid and help in more ways than one. He can jump along with it and clear brush, and he can land on it when he wants to jump off of a cliff. And he don't feel no bad effects from the jar. Well, I started to tell you how one of them beasts took off my dear friend, Jack Snodgrass. Jack used to work on this outfit, and one fall he was working the canyon, just like we'll be tomorrow, and Jack gets a glimpse of the Cbteddy. Jack was always a curious lad, so he tarried around to see what the critter was about. Jack was on the other side of a canyon anyway, and he allowed he'd have plenty of time to make his stampede if the critter showed any signs of combat. So Jack just looks across to see what's going on. Directly, the Cbteddy gets wind of him and looks him right straight for a minute or two. But Jack still ain't worried none, having the canyon between him and the ferocious beast. He just stands there and watches him to see what he is about. Pretty soon he notices that the Cbteddy is spading around on the ground with his tail. Presently, he scoops up a big boulder, just like you'd lift it with a shovel. He carries this on his tail, being careful not to let it fall off, and backs up and eases it off on the top of a bigger boulder. Jack begins to try to figure out a way to capture the brute. He allows if he ever could get him broke, he'd be a mighty handy animal to have around the place about tanking time. Well, the Cbteddy walks over to the other side of the rock he's set up and squats on his hind legs. Then he draws up his front legs and begins to whirl around and around on his hind legs, just like a spool of barbed wire on a crowbar when you're stringing fence. After he spins around a while, he lets down his tail, which hits the rock he's set up, which comes through the air like a cannonball. That was the last thing poor Jack ever knowed. We buried him, poor feller, next day. That is, all of him we could find. When we're over there tomorrow, I'll show you the place where he got killed, as well as a lot of other places where them critters has catapulted the rocks up and down the canyons just to keep in practice and for the fun of seeing them roll. Yeah, them club-tailed Cbteddy is ferocious animals. They're vicious brutes, agreed Joe, but they ain't got much on the gwinter. I never heard of a gwinter, said Lanky. Well, replied Joe, did you ever hear of a godafro? No. Did you ever hear of a sideswiper? No. Did you ever hear of a mountain stem winder? No, I never heard of them either. Well, they are really all one and the same thing, but the real true and correct name is gwinter. And what sort of a beast is he? Asked Lanky. Well, he's a grass-eating quadruped, said Joe. Something like a cross between a buffalo and a mountain goat, only he's a lot more ferocious. The peculiar thing about the gwinter is his legs. Instead of having 4 legs of equal length like a critter ought to have, or 2 short legs in front and 2 long ones behind like the Cbteddy, these brutes have 2 long legs on the downhill side and 2 short legs on the uphill side. This is mighty convenient for them, since they don't live on level ground nohow. Some of them has their right legs long, and some of them has their right legs short, depending on which way they graze around the mountains. The Chisos and the Davis and the Guadalupe mountains used to be full of them. Up there, them critters was thicker than the buffalo or the antelope on the plains. But they're getting mighty scarce now. Still, they took off many a cowhand in the early days, and sometimes yet a tenderfoot gets in the way of one of them, and don't come back home to the chuck wagon at night. If one of them critters ever starts toward you, Lanky, don't for anything let him know you're scared. If you try to run, he'll get you sure. Just stand there and look him right in the eye like you was glad to see him. He'll be coming right toward you with his head down like a bat shot out of a cannon. Still, don't move, and if you're in the saddle, hold your hoss. Just let that gwinter alone till he gets in 2 steps of you. Then take a couple of steps down the hill. He can't run the other way, and you'll be safe. 10 to 1, he'll be so mad about it, he'll try and follow you anyway. And when he gets his short legs downhill, he's a goner. Just stand by and watch him roll down the mountain and break his fool neck. That's one reason why they're so scarce. The cowboys learned that trick. Another reason is that they fought among themselves too much. You see, them that has their long legs on the right used to meet them that has their long legs on the left as they grazed around the mountains. And when the 2 of them met like that, they always tangled up. Finally, they fought till the weaker side all got killed. So now there's only one kind on each mountain. On some mountains, it's the right-leggers, and on some mountains, it's the left-leggers. If somebody would capture one alive, said Lanky, he could sell him into a circus for $5,000. That's been tried, son, that's been tried, replied Joe. However, your figure's too small. Once when I was punching cattle in the Chisos, Barnum and Bailey sent a feller all the way down from New York City with $50,000 to pay any man that would cage him a gwinter. For a long time he could get nobody to try it, till finally he came to our outfit. I won't endanger the lives of my men in any such manner and fashion, says the boss. However, he says, turning to us, if any of you men want to try it on your own hook, you can. There ain't much work to do right now, and I'll let you off for a few days. Well, we gets our best mounts and ropes and looks after our cinches and sets out. We scouts around a while, and sure enough, we hears one snort right near the foot of Eggshell Mountain. We lets out our wildest yells and fires off our 6-shooters, and somehow, by luck I guess, we gets the critter buffaloed, and he goes tearing around the mountain and us after him. Each time he goes around the mountain, he gets a little higher. We sees our hosses is going to give out if we don't figure out some way to spell him. We allows that since we got the critter on the run, 2 of us will be enough to go around the mountain and the others stay put. Then on the next round, 2 more goes, and so on and so forth. Each time we gets a bit nearer to the top. Finally, we all joins in order to be there when he gets to the top and can't go no further. And pretty soon, there he is at the top. How did he escape? Asked Lanky. Why, the brute just turned right through hisself, just clean wrong side out like a sock and run the other way. And that was the last you saw of him? Oh, we used to see him occasionally, as we knowed by his long legs being on the other side. But when winter came, he caught cold and died. And that's what you'll do, Lanky, if you sit there by the coals and shiver. You'd better get a little shut-eye before you stand guard. End of section 3.
Section 4 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by JessiB. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. Wind and Weather. The day had been blustery enough, and Lanky's eyes were red from the sands having cut into his eyeballs. There was still dust in the air, but at twilight the wind had subsided, and Lanky was experiencing that feeling of intense relief that comes when the sandstorm is over. During the day there had been little talk. Lanky had most of the time ridden within normal hailing distance of Red Wallace, but conversation would have been difficult, and neither he nor Red had been in the mood for it. At noon, each man swallowed his beans and bacon as rapidly as he could. Even then, he consumed a considerable quantity of sand. The old-timers were sitting expectantly around the fire. Their experience with Tenderfeet told them that Lanky would open the conversation, and that the topic would be the wind. "Terrible day we had," he observed. "How much sandstorm weather are we likely to have?" "Son," replied Red, "what you've seen today is the gentle zephyrs of spring. You ain't seen a real sandstorm." "Then," replied Lanky, "I'd like to know how I'm to know one when I meet it." Well, I'll tell you, Lanky, said Red. I'll tell you exactly how you can know. Do you recollect seeing a long chain hanging suspended from the big hackberry tree in front of the bunkhouse? That immense chain? Asked Lanky. Yeah, said Red. That's a log chain. And you wonder what it was up there for, no doubt. Well, it's to tell when there's a sandstorm. As long as it's hanging straight down, we know there ain't no wind to speak of. When it hangs out at an angle of 45 degrees, we speak of a slight breeze. It's only when she's sticking straight out parallel to the ground that it's correct and proper to speak of a windstorm. I think winds like that would blow all the houses and windmills over, observed Lanky. It ain't only the houses and windmills, said Hank. It's real estate. Why, there was a feller come in here one time and filed on a section of land in Colonel Slaughter's pasture, and a big sandstorm come along, and he never did find that section. He advertised in all the papers for it, offering a reward for its return, and he got lots of answers from people down in the brush country that had stray sections on their hands that they wanted to get rid of. But he looked 'em over and said none of 'em had his brand on 'em, and so he had to go back east. Yeah, the wind does some mighty funny things, said Joe. I come dang near losing the best saddle hoss I ever had on account of a sandstorm. I guess he got against a drift fence where the tumbleweeds and sand collected and buried the critter alive, said Hank. Nah, that wasn't it, replied Joe, though I've dug many a cow brute out of the sand drifts. It wasn't that. In them days I was working cattle out on the Monaghan's country. One evening, the boss tells me to swing up a little draw, saying the wagon would be at the head. Well, I got out of the draw just at dark, and I looked around, but I couldn't see no campfire anywheres in sight. I rode around a while, but still not seeing no signs of the wagon, and being tired, I decided to turn in. I was scared to turn my hoss loose. Brown Jug was his name, for fear he'd strike off to the remuda and leave me there afoot. So I stakes him to a little cottonwood bush on top of a mound. I knowed better than to hobble the critter, for he was wise to walking off with the hobbles on. Well, when I got him staked out, I took off the saddle, which I used for a pillow, and the blanket, which I used for a bed, and went to sleep. In the morning, when I woke up and looked around, the scenery wasn't exactly familiar. There was a big cottonwood tree which I couldn't remember seeing the night before, and I wondered how I come to miss it. And I looked some more, and there wasn't any Brown Jug in sight anywheres. I thinks to myself, the critter never played a dirty trick like that on me before, and I allows he must be round here somewheres. Surely, I says to myself, I ought to be able to find the bush I tied him to. So I whistles 3 times, and then I hears a weak nicker way up in the top of the tree, and I looks up, and damn me if there wasn't that poor critter with his tongue hanging out, dang nigh choked to death. Then I seen what had happened. I tied the hoss on top of a sand dune. The wind had come up and the sand had blowed away. What I calculated on being a bush was in fact a great big tree. So dang big, in fact, that the 30-foot lariat wouldn't let poor Brown Jug more than halfway to the ground. If I hadn't woke up just when I did, the poor brute would have choked to death, sure. How'd you get him down? Asked Lanky. Oh, that was easy, said Joe. In them days, I always had my old six gun by me, and I just whipped her out and put a bullet through the rope and let Brown Jug down. The fall didn't seem to hurt him none, and after he blowed a little while, he was as pert as ever. However, the wind got up again in the middle of the morning, and the only way I could keep the hoss on the ground was to tie big rocks to the horn of the saddle. That shows you've got more sense than a prairie dog, said Hank, which surprises me. Many a time on the South Plains during a sandstorm, I've seen them critters 10 feet in the air, digging with all their might, trying to get back to their holes. I'll tell you what I've seen, said Red, and it was the funniest sight I ever saw caused by a sandstorm. One day in the spring, the boss sent me out to pisen prairie dogs. He was one man I didn't work for long. He just couldn't stand to see a man not doing something. So when the wind would get bad and he didn't want to go out himself, he would send us out to ride fence and pisen dogs and the like. Well, this time I rode over to where I knowed there was a big town, and I rode up, and what do you suppose I saw? The sand was all blowed away, and there was them holes sticking 40 feet in the air. I never knowed before that time how crooked them critters made their residences. The wind's pretty hard on the rodents sometimes, said Hank. I knowed a wind, however, that helped out a poor human down on Sulphur Draw that was about to starve. This feller had come in to farm, and he raised a crib full of corn, but the ranchers wouldn't buy it because it wasn't shelled and wouldn't go in a morale. So the poor farmer was about to starve, and his old lady and kids to boot. This feller was just fresh from the sticks and didn't have much confidence in anybody anyway, and he allowed the ranchers was waiting for a chance to steal his corn. So he nailed up the crib door good and tight. He noticed a knothole in one of the walls, but he saw it was too little for an ear of corn to go through, so he just let that go. One day a wind come up, and the farmer and his folks hid in the dugout like prairie dogs, and the next day the wind laid, and they crawled out and looked around. And there was corn cobs scattered all alongside the crib. The old man thought sure somebody had stole his corn, but when he got the crib door open, he saw it there all shelled as purty as if he'd done it himself. He was a sort of ignorant and superstitious man, and the next day when I happened by, he says to me that the fairies had come and shelled his corn. Well, I never did take no stock in fairies and the like, and I know there must be a reasonable and sane explanation somewheres. So I picked up one of the corn cobs and stuck it in the knothole. It was just a good tight fit. Then I told the man what must have happened. The wind got up and would have blowed all his corn out of the crib, but the knothole wasn't big enough for an ear to go through. Hence each ear got shelled and all the corn was left in the crib. It was just as simple as that. Perfectly natural. If them old fellers we read about that believed in fairies and witches and all that crap had just used their heads, they'd found out that everything's natural and simple enough. They put me in mind of Mexicans, but as I was about to say, the old man sold his corn and got on pretty well. There was a farmer close to us one time, said Joe, that lost his milk cows in a curious manner. He had a little patch of popcorn, and one hot day the cows broke into the patch and started eating it up. All of a sudden that corn begun popping and flying every which way. Did the shooting grains kill the cows? Asked Lanky. Nah, said Joe. When the fool critters saw all that popcorn flying through the air, they thought it was snow and just naturally froze to death. Do you ever have tornadoes out here? Said Lanky. You mean cyclones? Asked Joe. Well, yes, sometimes. A queer thing happened to me one time up here just below the Cap Rock. We was going up the trail, and one evening it was hot as blazes and sultry and still. The cattle was getting nervous, and we was all expecting hell to break loose any time. And sure enough, it did. A cloud come up in the northwest, and it thundered and lightened, and then the storm struck us. Them steers just naturally hoisted their tails and left the country. I was on a good hoss, but it was all I could do to stay in sight of them cattle. My pony was giving me all he had, and he wasn't gaining on them steers none. Neither was the other boys getting close to him. Directly I looked back over my shoulder like, and there was them clouds biling and whirling around in the sky. Then all at once a funnel drops down and takes out after me. I started quirting my horse. I feel right mean about it, yet when I think about it, for he was doing his best to catch that herd, and he couldn't do no more. Well, the next thing I knowed, I was up in the air, still in the saddle with my hoss under me, whirling round and round like a top. That cyclone carried me around in the air like that for a half an hour or more, me scared all the time that it was going to drop me. But it didn't. After a while, it sets me down just as gentle as a mother with her baby. I looks up, and there's the herd coming, hell-bent for election, right towards me. I gets off my slicker and fires off my 6-shooter and turns them steers and gets 'em to milling. Pretty soon, the other boys rides up, and we gets 'em quieted down, and the whole outfit has to set up and sing to 'em all night. The next day, we counted 'em out, and we hadn't lost a single head. Not a single cow brute was missing. If it hadn't been for that cyclone, we'd been gathering cattle for a week, and then likely we wouldn't have found 'em all. That's the way it is, said Red. Some winds is good, and some winds is bad, but I'd rather have sandstorms and risk a cyclone once in a while than have a mud in the rainy season like they have on the Black Land Divide. We found lots of mud when we drove through last fall, said Lanky. You just thought you found mud, replied Red. You ought to have seen them flats before they begun making roads. When I first hit that country, they was just fencing off the lanes, and when I got a job, the boss put me to riding fence. One day I was riding along by the lane, and I looked over, and there was a good, brand new Stetson hat lying on the top of a mud hole. I thinks to myself, that's a good hat, and I might as well have it as the next feller. So I got down and got a hold of a fence post to steady myself and reached out to get it. Just as I touched the crown, a feller yelled out, "Hey, what you doing there?" he says. Then I noticed for the first time that there was a man's head sticking out of the mud. I asked the feller if he needed my help, but he said he was riding a mighty good hoss and he guessed he'd make it through all right. He afterwards got to be a mighty good friend of mine. Pete Jackson was his name. Well, sir, said Joe, speaking of mud, that puts me in mind of one experience I had going up the trail in '83. We was kind of late in getting through, and the rainy weather had already set in before we crossed the Black Land Divide. We hadn't hardly got across when we begun to notice that our hosses was losing all their pertness. The boss's pet cow hoss got as lazy as a jackass. My own favorite hoss, Brown Jug, just got sleepier and sleepier, till finally he just lay down and went to sleep and never did wake up. We lost half of our remuda just like that. The boss was terribly worried because he didn't like the idea of training on foot, and because he didn't know whether his hands would stay with him or not if he didn't have nothing for him to ride. Well, I figured there must be a cause of hoss sickness just as there is for everything else, so I begins to take note. I notices that all the sick hosses has mud balls on their tails. Then I guesses what must be the matter. The weight of the mud on the critters' tails was making such a pull on the brutes' hides that they just couldn't shut their eyes. And I figured that being unable to shut their eyes, they was just naturally dying for sleep. I tells the boss and we cuts off the balls of mud. As soon as we cut one off, the critter would fall into a deep sleep, just like Adam in the Bible. Some of the worst ones slept steady for 4 days and nights and then woke up fresh and pert as ever. Still, said Red, it ain't the mud and it ain't the wind that makes Texas weather bad. It's the sudden and quick changes. That's right, said Hank. That's right, as our new boss found out once. He allowed he was going to keep a record of the weather. So he comes home with a brand new thermometer and hangs it up on the front porch and calls us boys to look at it. Well, sir, while we was standing there, the mercury runs up to about 90 or 100 to get a good start. Then all of a sudden, down she goes with such a jar that she just naturally knocks the bottom right out of the tube and ruins the boss's new thingamabob. Good instrument it was, too. Not just a mercantile advertisement, but a good one that he had bought and paid money for. But that didn't faze that man none. He sent off back east somewheres and had one made to order with a rubber cushion in the bottom of the tube to take up the jar when the mercury fell. He got a patent on that idea and got rich. His thermometers are in use all over the Southwest. They're the only kind that'll stand the climate. This fellow was just crazy about his new thermometer. He was always looking to see how cold it was or how hot it was. Once a norther came up in the night, and he just had to get up and go look at his instrument. He struck a match so he could see, and the match just froze, and he had to build a fire and warm it up before he could blow it out. That might sound a bit windy to a feller that didn't know the country, said Joe, but it's probably so. I seen sunshine freeze right on the streets of Amarillo one time. During one of the long cold spells they had up there, all the chickens died for want of sleep. You see, they couldn't tell when it was night, and the sunshine stayed froze so long they just naturally died. Speaking of things freezing, said Red, I've seen words freeze. Once we was out in a blizzard cutting drift fences and trying to point the herds to the canyons, and we'd yell and cuss the critters, but we couldn't even hear ourselves. Well, sir, we finally got the brutes into the breaks and was on our way back when it started moderating. All of a sudden, we heard the dangest mess of yelling and cussing and cowballing that you ever heard tell of. Presently, we recognized the very words we had spoke on the way down. "It seems to me," said Lanky, "that I learned a story something like that from Addison and Steele." "Doubtless," said Red. "Doubtless you did. This that I was telling about happened right over here on Addison and Steele's outfit. I was working for 'em at the time." "Yeah," said Hank, "them northers come mighty sudden at times. One time, Bill Anchor and me rides up to a tank, and the day's so warm and purty we decides to go in swimming. We was just ready to strip off when all of a sudden we notices the bullfrogs all along the dam jumping out of the willows like bats shot out of a cannon. They hit the water all right and went under, but them critters got fooled that time. They poked out their heads like they always do, and there they was, froze tight as a hat band in the ice. All along the side of the tank for about 10 feet from the dam, the ice was just naturally speckled with frog heads." "That puts me in mind," said Joe, "of a tale Bill Bishop used to tell. Bill said one time he started in swimming and dove off of a high bluff into a deep hole of water. But just as he was leaving the bluff, a drought come and dried up all the water. Bill thought sure he'd kill himself on the rock bottom of the creek bed, but down comes a rise from a rain up above and fills up the hole just in time to save him." "Lucky," said Lanky. "Yes," said Joe, "I guess he was, yet not so powerful lucky after all. Just as he was sticking up his head, it got froze in the ice like them frogs Hank was telling you about, and he had to stay there all day before the boys come and chopped him out. Leastwise, that's what he used to tell, but he was such a damn windy that you never knowed when he was telling the truth and when he was trying to load somebody." End of section 4. Read by JessiB.
Section 5 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. By the breadth of a hair. Lanky had become intensely interested in the narratives of Joe and his apprentices. He was happy that he had been assigned to the same guard. All during the day he had been trying to think of the most pregnant question to put when the day's work should be over and he should again sit with the Windy trio around the campfire. He thought of one that he felt sure would elicit an interesting yarn. "What," he asked Joe, "was the narrowest escape you ever had?" Joe pulled out a shuck. He reached leisurely the sack of Bull Durham in his vest pocket. He rolled the cigarette with deliberation. He was not going to play the fool by committing himself in any superlative way until he had heard from his upstart rivals, young men trying to usurp the arts and prerogatives universally recognized as belonging to the old. "Well," he said, "that would be hard to say. Hard to say. When a man knocks around as much as I have, and in the days when the West was wild, too, he's bound to have had many a close call, what with Mexicans, rustlers, bad men, stampedes, blizzards, and the like. However, one of the worst scares I ever had was once when I got caught in a buffalo stampede. I reckon you know something about the buffalo." "Yes," said Lanky, "I've read a little bit about them." "Well," said Joe, "I can't say as I've read very much about 'em. I seen the plains black with 'em, and I've killed a many a one in my day, too. Well, I started out to tell you what a close shave I had one time at Buffalo Gap. I was a full young buck then, and one morning in the spring, after I first hit that country, I heard a great roaring and bellowing, and I listened a while, wondering what it was. Then I says to myself, I bet that's a buffalo herd. For I had heard the old-timers tell about 'em and how they come through the pass called Buffalo Gap every spring, going north. I rides up on one of the hills that overlooks the gap so as I could look right down on the beasts as they come by. There I stops to see 'em pass. I didn't get there much too soon, for right away the whole pass was choked with buffalo, as thick as they could crowd, jammed in closer than steers in a stock car. I was riding a full bronc, and he got to rearing and a-pitching, and the first thing I knowed, we was rolling down the hill together. Well, the hoss turned 3 or 4 cats in the air, and first he was on top, and then I was, but the critter lit feet down right on top of the backs of them buffalo, and I was still in the saddle, and didn't have no bones broke. Don't ask me whether I pulled leather or not, Lanky. Don't ask me that. Well, them brutes begun to run, and the first thing I knowed, they was in a regular stampede. I seen what was happening. They was carrying me and that hoss north just as fast as they could run, which was purty fast. Yes, sir, purty fast. I reins the hoss around and turns him south and digs his sides with the brawls, and he runs toward the south just as fast as he could, and he was a right pert pony, too. Well, sir, I rides and I rides, all the time keeping my eye peeled for the tail end of the herd, but I sees nothing but buffalo, miles and miles of 'em. It was about the middle of the morning when my hoss fell off with me like that, and an hour by sun I was still riding all the time looking for the end of the herd and thinking it surely would come sometime. I happened to look to the side, and what do you think I seen, Lanky? What do you think I seen? Help coming, I suppose, said Lanky. No such luck, said Joe. No such luck. It was the bushes we broke and the rocks we turned over when me and that hoss rolled down the hill. Well, I rides another half hour, I guess, and I begins to feel the hoss quiver and shake under me, and I knowed the jig was about up. When a hoss does that way, Lanky, he's about ready to drop dead, and I knowed that might happen any time. Pretty soon I sees an opening, and just as that pony jumped off the rump of the last buffalo, damn me if he didn't drop in his tracks dead as a hammer. I knowed that was going to happen when I felt him quiver. Well, I climbed out on the hill afoot, forgetting to get my saddle, and damn lucky it was I forgot, too, for as soon as I got to the top of the hill and sat down on a rock to rest, I looked back, and there was the main herd coming into sight, roaring and bellowing like a cyclone. I had to walk back to my outfit, and several days later I rode back to the pass, but all I found of that hoss and saddle was a little greasy spot on the ground. That was a narrow escape, said Lanky. I suspect you have had as many close calls as anybody. Well, I couldn't say about that, said Joe, but I know that if that hoss had give out 10 minutes sooner, Joe Martin wouldn't be sitting here talking to you tonight. Yeah, said Hank. Joe always was a lucky cuss. If he was to fall in a sewer, he'd come out with a lily in each hand. Now me, I was born too late, land all took up, buffalo all gone, no more trail driving up north. Still, what with reptiles and beasts and Mexico steers and bucking hosses and the like, I've had my share of close calls. Funny how some little thing you don't expect just as like as not comes along and ticks you off. Nothing ain't got you yet, Hank, said Red. You're here, ain't you? What you kicking about? I was just thinking how near I come to being killed once, and if it hadn't have been for Zach Weber, I would have been. That lad could handle a 6-gun, I can tell you. I've seen him knock down 6 flying quail with his old Colt 45, riding at a high run. He could turn 6 pigeons loose at one time and knock every one of them down before they could get away. When he went duck hunting, he never packed anything but his old 6-shooter. Some of the boys had shotguns, but Zach said his conscience never would get over it if he turned one of them murderous implements loose on a poor, helpless fowl. And he never shot a duck on the water, either. Not Zach. Mighty glad I was that he could shoot like that, too, for he'd saved my life. Bandit trouble? Asked Lanky. No, worse, said Hank. Though I could tell you something about Glen Springs, but that's not the time Zach saved my life. Have you ever seen a centipede, Lanky? No, said Lanky. I don't suppose I have. Well, I'll tell you what they look like so as you'll know 'em. And don't catch 'em for playthings, Lanky. Don't catch 'em for playthings. Just as well pet a rattlesnake. They're flat yeller worms with 100 legs like fringe on each side, and on every foot there's a little hook that the centipede can hook into things that he walks on. And them hooks, is so poisonous that if he walks across your skin while he's mad, your flesh will putrefy and you'll go as crazy as a locoed hoss, and like as not take to the bushes like a jackrabbit unless somebody holds you. That's how poisonous they are. Well, what I started out to tell you was, one time at dinner, me and Zach was sitting on the ground about 50 feet apart, facing each other, eating our beans and sow belly. All at once I got a glimpse of something like a yellow streak running up my vest on my bandana, but I just barely did get a glimpse and couldn't tell what it was. "Is there something on my neck?" I says to Zach. "Good God, man," says Zach, "it's a centipede." Well, we took off our gloves to eat, and I knowed if I tried to knock the critter off, I'd just make him mad, and he'd get me sure. And I knowed if Zach come over to knock him off with a stick or something, he'd be dead certain to chase him off on my neck. "Let him alone," I says, "and maybe he'll crawl off after a while." "Just be still," says Zach, and he whips out his old 6-shooter, and I hears the bullet whistle by my ear. "I got him," says Zach. And I takes off my bandana, and there is just a little speck where the bullet had just barely touched it. I always did feel grateful to Zach after that, for he sure did save my life that day. "You think, then, that if the centipede had touched your skin, he would really have killed you?" asked Lanky. "I don't think nothing about it," said Hank. "I know it. Why, I tell you what happened. You see, Zach didn't have time to look what was on the other side of me when he shot, but just as he pulled the trigger, he noticed an old cow brute standing about 50 yards off, chewing his cud. Well, this old steer jumped, so Zach said he must have hit him. Still, we couldn't see no wound on him. We roped him and looked at the critter close and found a bullet hole in his dewlap." "In his what?" asked Lanky. "Why, in his dewlap," said Hank. "That's the gristle thing that hangs down from the neck of a cow brute just where it joins on to the breast. They used to vaccinate for the black leg by making a hole in it. We know the steer couldn't be hurt much there, so we turns him loose, and he gets up and starts off. He hadn't gone more than 20 steps when his neck was all swole up big as a saddle hoss. Then he began to rave and to charge and beller so pitifully that we just shot him to get him out of his misery. That's how poisonous them centipedes are. When I saw that poor brute all swole up and out of his head with torment, I knowed what a close call I'd had." Lanky's attention had been divided between Red and the narrator. He had glanced several times at Joe also, who was sitting complacent but not contemptuous, listening with the respect due a good liar, even though a comparatively inexperienced one. But Red, during the first part of Hank's narrative, had been in a deep study. He rolled several cigarettes, only to throw them away after taking a puff or two. He appeared to listen, yet it was obvious that the narrator did not have his full attention. Near the climax to Hank's tale, however, his countenance brightened up, and from that time he sat quietly as one having an ace in the hole. When Hank finished, he was ready. "I didn't have no crack shot, nor no friend of no kind to help me out once when I come near passing in my checks out in the Glass Mountains. I never did know what was the matter with that fool hoss I was riding. He'd always been a mighty sensible animal, fine cow pony, quarter hoss, single footer, and the best night hoss on the outfit. I'd rode him hard that day, and I thought maybe he was tired of life and took a sudden notion to kill hisself like an English feller that come to our outfit and stayed a while once. Then again, I thought he might have went blind all at once. I never could figure it out. Anyway, he never acted like that before." "What did he do?" asked Mikey. "What did he do? He done a plenty. Still, I don't blame him, poor brute. There must have been something the matter. You see, I was riding back to the headquarters on a dark night. I was about half asleep, for I knowed that old Frijoli, that was his name, would find the way. He always could. Well, I was riding along that way when all of a sudden I finds us both falling down through empty space. Seemed like we never would hit the ground, and before we got bottom, I figured out what had happened. Out in the edge of the Glass Mountains there was a big sinkhole right out on the mesa. It was as big across as a house, and 6 lariats deep, right straight down. We afterwards measured it, and Frijoles had loped off into that dang hole with me, and there we was making for the bottom. I thinks to myself, this is where you pass in your checks, Red. Some gets it early and some gets it late, but they all gets it. Then we hits bottom. I guess I was shook up purty bad, for I woke up after a while, and there I was setting on a dead hoss. You see, Frijoles had broke his neck landing, poor feller. I always will wonder what was a-eatin' on him to make him lope off into a hole like that. Must have been something. Well, I seen there wasn't nothing I could do but wait for daylight and then try to figure out some way to get out, so I just laid down and took a nap till morning. When daylight come, I got up and looked around, but the walls was straight up and down, and there wasn't nothing I could get a hold of to climb out. Then I took the rope off my saddle and begun to look for something 20 feet or so up that I could rope, thinking I could pull myself up that far, and then maybe rope something else a little higher up and pull myself up again, and so on till I was out. But there wasn't a thing like it, not a bush, nor a rock, nor nothing sticking out I could get a loop on. Everything as slick as glass. Well, maybe the boys will come and hunt me, I thinks, but how in the hell would they know to look down in here? I waited all day, and not a soul come, and I waited all the next day, and still nobody come. The third day I was still there and no better off than I was in the beginning. By that time I was wishing I was dead, for I had drunk up all the water in my saddle canteen, and I was getting hungry too. Couldn't you have eaten some of the horse meat? Asked Lanky. Yes, I guess I could have, said Red, but at first I wouldn't out of friendship for the brute. For even if he did get me in there, I always figured there was something wrong. He went out of his head or something. And after I got hungry enough to have ate him, anyway, his carcass had spiled and was stinking something terrible. That's principally what made it so bad. Every breath I drawed was misery. Finally, I says, Red, you can't stand this no longer. You'd shoot a poor dumb brute if you saw him in torment like this. And so I cocks my 6-shooter and holds it to my head. But somehow I can't pull the trigger. Stand it a little while longer, I says to myself, and if help don't come, shoot. I done that 3 or 4 times, I guess. After a while, buzzards begun flying over the hole, dozens of 'em, sailing round and round. They knowed there was something dead somewheres around, but they was having trouble locating it. They kept coming lower and lower, till directly one comes down into the sinkhole. Then some more come, and they would fly right down close to me. I reckon you come after Frijoles, I says, but just wait a little while and you can have me too. And just then I had an idea. I picks up my lariat, right quiet-like, and begins unraveling it into little strands. In each little strand I tied a noose. Then I takes my seat by the side of the carcass and just waits. Directly a big turkey buzzard comes right down close, and I throws a loop over his head and fetches him down. Then I sticks him to my belt, giving him about 6 foot of rope. After a while I gets another one. I keeps on until I gets 20 of the vultures staked to my belt. Then I fires off my 6-shooter, skeering 'em all at once. Well, sir, them birds just naturally lifted me right out of that sinkhole. You were lucky, said Lanky. Lucky? Lad, that wasn't luck, that was head work. You ain't heard about my luck yet. Them buzzards begun flying away with me, but I seen what direction they was going, and I just let 'em alone and watched the lay of the land. And when they had me right over a big haystack at the headquarters of my own outfit, I reached down and unbuckled my belt, and damn me if I didn't land right on the hay without any hurtin' at all. I walked up to the house and had a square meal, and I ate too, I'll tell you, and then I felt as fresh and pert as ever. That was a lucky landing, said Lanky. It sure was, said Red. I got off light. The worst thing about it was that them vultures carried off my belt, and a crackerjack it was too, trimmed with rattlesnake hide and gold studs. $28.50 it cost me over the counter at KC, Missouri. Lanky expected Joe to tell the next story, but the veteran smoked placidly and graciously surrendered his turn to Hank. "A thing like that nearly happened to me once," said Hank, "except it was a canyon instead of a sinkhole. I ought to have had more sense than to ride a fool bronc like the critter I was on around a place like that, but I was green in them days. You see, I was riding around a rim rock looking out for steers in the canyon down below, and down below it was, sure enough, 500 feet straight down, just as straight as a wall. Well, I'd rode along that way for a while, when suddenly I took a fool notion to smoke. So I rolled me a fat tamale and pulled out a match and struck it on my saddle horn. Just then that fool bronc bogged his head and begun pitching and bawling like 6 bits, and the next thing I knowed he'd fell off that rim rock, and it was 500 feet to the bottom if it was an inch. When that hoss hit the bottom, he just naturally splattered all over the scenery." "And you?" asked Lanky. "Well, you see," said Hank, "when we went off that rim rock together, I knowed that saddle that I had been trying so hard to stay in was no place for me then, so I got off. And I had to be damn quick about it, too. I wasn't much more than off the brute when he hit the bottom." Lanky expected Joe to send him off to bed. There were cattle to gather during the day and to hold at night until all the pastures should be worked, and it was Joe who usually reminded the unseasoned boy that sleep was necessary, even if Lanky preferred the romancing of the older hands. But Joe merely chunked up the fire. "That puts me in mind," said he, "of a hunt I went on once in the Guadalupe Mountains. You see, we was out after big-horned sheep. Used to be lots of 'em up there, but they are about all gone now, few up in the mountains where the tin-horn hunters never go. I was follerin' some of them critters around a ledge, and presently I looked around and seen where I was. The ledge was just about a foot wide, and I looked down, and there was a bluff right straight down for 500 feet, and I looked up, and there was a wall 500 feet straight up. There wasn't no way to get off that ledge but to go on or to turn back like I come, and in some places the footin' was mighty ticklish. Well, I walked along till I come to a slick place, and my foot slipped, and I had to let go my gun to keep from falling. I sure hated to lose that 30-30 too, for we had been friends for years, and many a deer and antelope and bear and panther I had fetched down with it. But I just naturally lost my balance and had to let her go to save my neck. Well, not having any gun, I thought I had just as well go back to the camp, so I started back like I come. I goes around a little bend, and there comes a mountain lion, a-creeping along towards me just like a cat trying to slip up on a snowbird. Says I, "Joe, this ain't no place for you. I expect you'd better go on the way you first started." So I turns around and goes back around the bend. When I gets about 100 yards, there I sees a big grizzly bear comin' to meet me, and when he sees me, he sets up and shows his teeth and growls. Says I, "Joe, maybe you'd better go back the other way after all." I thought maybe the cougar would be gone, but as soon as I gets turned around, and I had to be mighty careful in turnin', for the ledge was powerfully narrow, when I turns around, I sees the big cat sneaking along toward me, and when I looked the other way, there comes the bear. And they are both getting closer and closer, and there I am, and it's 500 feet straight down, and it's 500 feet straight up. "How did you get off?" asked Lanky. "How did I get off? Why, I couldn't get off. They got me. But whether it was the bear or the cougar, I never did know." Joe finished with a flourish, but without a smile. He pulled out his watch. "Doggone," he said. "I never had no idea it was so late. We ought to have been asleep before now. Lanky, you ought not to let these boys keep you up so late. They'd talk you to death if you'd just sit here and listen to 'em." End of section 5. Section 6 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Section 6 of Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. The Genesis of Pecos Bill. "I suppose," said Lanky, as he sat by the campfire with Red and Hank and Joe, now his fast friends, "that the cowboy's life is about the most interesting one there is. I'd like it. Live outdoors, plenty of fresh air to breathe, interesting work, that's the life." "I ain't kicking," said Joe. "You see I'm still at it, though I've cussed it as much as anybody in my time, and swore off and quit, too, more than once. But somehow when spring comes, and the grass gets green, and I know the calves is coming, something just naturally gets under my hide, and I come back to the smell of burnt hair and the creak of saddle leather." "Yeah," said Red. "It's just like a dream I had once. I dreamt I died and went up to a place where there was big pearly gates, and I walked up and knocked on the door, and it come wide open. I went in, and there stood St. Peter. 'Come in. Welcome to our city,' he says. 'I've been looking for you. Go over to the commissary and get you a harp and a pair of wings.' 'All right,' says I, feeling mighty lucky to get in. As I walked along on the gold sidewalk, I sees a lot of fellers roped and hobbled and hog-tied. 'What's the matter?' says I. 'St. Peter, you're not trying to buffalo me, are you?' 'No,' he says. 'What makes you think so? Your record ain't nothing extra good, but you didn't get cut back, did you? Here you are. You're in. Ain't that enough?' 'Ain't this hell?' I says. 'No,' says Peter. 'This ain't hell at all.' 'Are you sure this ain't hell?' I asks. 'No,' he says, 'this ain't hell. What makes you think 'tis?' 'Why,' I says, 'what you got all them fellers roped and tied down for?' 'Oh,' he says, 'them fellers over there, you see them's cowboys from the Southwest, and I have to keep 'em tied to keep 'em from going back. I think maybe they'll get range broke after a while so I can turn 'em loose, but it seems like it's taking a long time.' 'However,' said Joe, 'the cow business ain't what it used to be. What with barbed wire, windmills, automobiles, and trucks and the like, they don't want cow hands anymore. What they want is blacksmiths, mechanics, and the like. Still, I reckon it's a good thing, for they couldn't get cow hands if they did want 'em. Now here's Red and Hank, good boys, both of 'em, and I've learned 'em a lot about cattle, and they take money at the rodeos. But they ain't like the old cow hands. I don't know just what it is, but they ain't the same. And they ain't but mighty few real cowmen anymore. Now take the big mogul of this outfit, good feller. Always pays wages every month, which is more than some of the old-timers could do, but he ain't no cowman. Sits up all day at a big desk in town, has a secretary, stenographer, and the like. Why, if Pecos Bill had done a thing like that, he would have been so ashamed of himself he would have just naturally laid down and died." "Who is this Pecos Bill I've heard you mention?" asked Lanky. "Who is he? Why, ain't you ever heard of Pecos Bill?" "Not till I came here." Well, I reckon you've heard of Sam Houston and Sam Bass and General Lee and George Washington and Pat Garrett, ain't you?" "Oh, yes, I've heard a little about them, but not anything about Pecos Bill." "That just shows that the fellers that make our books don't know what to put in 'em. The idea of leaving out Pecos Bill. But who was Pecos Bill? Who was he? Why, he was just about the most celebrated man in the whole dang cow country. What was his real name?" "So far as I know, the only real name he ever had was Pecos Bill. Don't suppose anybody knows what his daddy's name was. You see, in his day, it wasn't good manners to ask a feller his name, and besides, it wasn't good judgment either. And it ain't been so long. Many a greenhorn, being ignorant of that little point of good manners, has looked down the muzzle of a six-shooter and then died. Pecos Bill's daddy didn't say what they called him back in the States, and nobody asked him. They just called him the old man, for he was old, about 70-some-odd when he came to Texas." "When did he come to Texas?" asked Lanky. "I couldn't say about that exactly," said Joe. "It must have been right about the time Sam Houston discovered Texas. Anyhow, the old man loaded up all his 12 kids and his old woman and his rifle and all his other stuff in an ox wagon and lit out hell-bent for Texas as soon as he found out there was such a place. They say other people that come later didn't have no trouble finding the way. They just went by the Indian skeletons that the old man left along his road. Well, they finally got to the Sabine River. The old man stops his oxen, old Spot and Buck he calls them, and rounds up all his young'uns and has 'em set down and listen while he makes 'em a speech. Young'uns, he says, that land you see on the other side of the river is Texas, wild and woolly and full of fleas. And if you ain't that way only more so, you ain't no brats of mine. I'd always heard that Pecos Bill was born in Texas, interrupted Red. Just wait, said Joe. Just wait, have I said he wasn't? Them was the other kids. As I was about to say, they crossed the river and camped for the night. That was in Texas, savvy? And that night, Pecos Bill was born. The next morning, the old woman put him on a bear's skin and left him to play with hisself while she made the corn pone for breakfast. And right then's when they come dang near losing Pecos Bill. Bears or Indians? Asked Lanky. Neither one, said Joe. Bears and Indians didn't mean nothing to that old man. He would have ate 'em for breakfast. Once later, when the old man and the older brats was gone, the Comanches did try to get Bill, but the old woman lit into 'em with the broom handle and killed 49 right on the spot. She never knowed how many she crippled and let get away. No, it wasn't the Indians, it was mosquitoes. Malaria? Said Lanky. You guessed wrong again, said Joe. This is what happened. The old woman was cooking corn pone, and all of a sudden it got dark, and there was the dangest singing and humming you ever heard. Then they seen it was a swarm of big black mosquitoes, and they was so thick around Bill that you just couldn't see him. The old man felt his way to the wagon and got out his gun. He thought he'd shoot it off in the air and scare them mosquitoes away. He pointed the muzzle of the gun toward the sky and pulled the trigger. What he seen then was a little beam of light come through. It was just like being in a dark room and looking out through a piece of windmill pipe. That was just for a minute, for right away the hole shed up, and then mosquitoes swarmed around Pecos, and the old man seen they was going to pack him off if he didn't do something right away. Then he happened to recollect that he'd brought his hog rendering kettle along, so he fought his way back to the wagon and rolled it out and turned it over the kid. He was scared the lad would get lonesome under there by hisself, so he just slipped the chopping axe onto the edge of the kettle for the chap to play with. Well, them danged mosquitoes just buzzed and buzzed around the kettle trying to find a way to get in. Directly, they all backed off, and the old man and the old woman thought they'd give up and was going away. Then all at once, one of them mosquitoes comes at that kettle like a bat out of hell. He hit the kettle and rammed his bill clean through it, and he stuck there. Then another one come at the kettle just like the first one had, and he stuck too. Then they kept coming, and every one stuck. The old man and the old woman and the older brats stood there watching them mosquitoes ram that kettle. After each one of them varmints, they was too big to be called insects, hit the kettle, there would be a little ring. Ding! Like that. Purty soon the old folks got on to what was happening. Every time a mosquito would ram his bill through the kettle, Pecos would brat it with the chopping axe. Well, after a while, them mosquitoes just naturally lifted that kettle right up and flew off with it. The others thought they had Pecos Bill and followed the kettle off. Of course, the old man hated to lose his utensil. He said he didn't know how the old woman was going to render up the lard and bear's grease now, but it was worth 100 kettles to know he had such a smart brat. And from that time, the old man would always talk about Bill as a chap of great possibilities. He allowed that if the brat just had the proper raising, he'd make a great man some day. He said he was going to try to do his part by him, so he begun giving him a diet of jerked game with whiskey and onions for breakfast. He lapped it up so well that in 3 days the old woman weaned him. Did the old man settle there on the Sabine? Asked Lanky. No, said Joe. He squatted on a little sandy hill on the Trinity somewheres east of where Dallas is now. It was just an accident that he stopped where he did. How was that? Asked Lanky. Well, said Joe, you see, it was like this. They was traveling west in their customary and habitual manner, which was with the old man and the 6 oldest kids walking alongside Spot and Buck, and the old woman and the 7 youngest kids in the wagon. Just as they was coming to the foot of a sandy hill, a big rain come up. It rained so hard that the old man couldn't see the wagon, but he stuck close to them trusty oxen of his, and they went right up the hill. When he got to the top, He seen that it had about quit raining, and he looked back and seen the wagon still at the bottom of the hill, and there was the brats that had been walking with him under it. "Did the harness break?" asked Lanky. "No, it wasn't that," said Joe. "You see, he was using a rawhide lariat for a log chain, and it had got wet. I reckon you know what rawhide does when it gets wet, don't you, Lanky? It stretches. There ain't no rubber that will stretch like wet rawhide. Well, that's what happened to that lariat. It stretched so that the old man drove his oxen a mile up the hill without moving the wagon an inch. Not an inch had he moved her, by gar. Well, the sun was shining now, and it got brighter and brighter, and while the old man was wondering what in the dickens to do next, old Spot just dropped down dead from sunstroke. That sort of got next to the old man, for he said that brute had been a real friend to him, and besides he was worth his weight in gold. Still, he allowed he might as well skin him, so he got out his old bowie knife and started to work. Well, sir, while he was skinning Spot, a norther came up, and damn me if old Buck didn't keel over, froze to death. So the old man decided he'd just as well stop there where he was, so he told the old woman to bring up the brats. He throwed the ox yoke over a stump, and the old woman brought up some chuck and some bedding from the wagon. Then they ate supper and tucked the kids into bed. The old man tried to blow out the lantern, but she wouldn't blow. He raised up the globe, and there was the flame froze stiff as an icicle. He just broke it off and buried it in the sand and turned in and went to sleep. The next morning, when he woke up, it was clear and the sun was warm. Well, the old woman cooked a bite, and while they was eating, here come the wagon right up the hill. You see, the rawhide was drying out. That's the way it does. "That's what it does, all right," said Red. "Once I knowed a clodhopper that made hisself a rawhide hat. It worked fine till one day he got caught out in the rain. Then the sun come out, and that hat drawed up so he couldn't get it off. And it was drawing up and mashing his head something terrible. Lucky for him, it wasn't very far to a tank, and he got off and stood on his head in the water a few minutes, and it come right off." "Well," said Joe, "that's what the rawhide log chain done. It dried out, and that wagon come right up the hill, and when it got up to where the old man and the old woman was, the old man got his chopping axe and begun cutting down trees to make him a cabin, and that's where he settled." "Did Pecos Bill grow up there in East Texas?" asked Lanky. "He left when he was a mere lad," said Joe, "but he lived there a little while. The old man got along fine till his corn give out, because there was plenty of game, but he just couldn't do without his corn pone and his corn whiskey, so he cleared a little patch and put it in corn." "And worked it without his steers?" asked Lanky. "Why not?" said Joe. "He made him a light Georgie stock out of wood, and the old woman and one of the bigger kids could pull it fine. He made some harness out of the hide of old Spot, and he'd hitch him and plow all day. They used to all go out in the field and leave Pecos Bill in the cabin by hisself. One day when Bill was about 3 years old, the old man was plowing, and just as he turned the old woman and the kid he had hitched up with her around to start a new row, the old woman begun yelling and trying to get out of the harness. "What's eating on you, old woman?" says the old man. "I never seen you do like this before. Must have a tick in your ear." The old woman yelled that she seen a panther go in the cabin where Bill was. The old man told her not to get excited. "It's a half hour by sun till dinner time yet," he says, "and that dang panther needn't expect no help from me nohow. The fool critter ought to have had more sense than to go in there. He'll just have to make out the best way he can." So they plowed on till dinner time, and when they come back to the cabin, there was Pecos Bill a-chewing on a piece of raw panther flank. They lived there another year or two before the old man taken a notion to leave. "I reckon you know how he come to get the idea in his head, don't you, Joe?" said Red. "I'll buy it," said Joe. "Go ahead." "Why, this ain't no sell," said Red. "I've heard Wendy Williams tell it 100 times. One time the old man had the old woman and one of the big kids hitched up to the plow in his customary and habitual manner, just as Joe has been telling about, and all at once here comes a piece of paper blowing across the field. The old woman shied a little bit off to one side, then the kid got to prancing, and then they tore loose and went lickety-split, rearing and tearing across that corn patch, dragging the old man with them. The old man stumped his toe on a root, and then they got loose from him and tore up the Georgie stock. After a while they quieted down, and the old man got up and fetched them in. Then he went out and picked up the piece of paper where it was hung on a stump. He seen it was an old newspaper. That set him to wondering. The next morning he got his rifle and begun looking around. About 5 miles from his place he found some wagon tracks, and he followed the tracks till he come to a new cabin about 50 miles up the creek. Then he come home and told the old woman and the kids to get ready to leave. He calculated the country was getting too thickly settled for him. How did he get away without a team? Asked Lanky. Oh, that was easy, said Red. He sent Pecos Bill out to catch a couple of mustangs, and in about an hour the lad run 'em down. The old man fixed up the harness he'd been using to plow with, and loaded in his stuff and his wife and kids, and pulled out. They kept going west till finally they come to the Pecos River, which the old man said he'd ford or bust. He got across all right, but as he was driving up the bank on the west side, the end gate come out of the wagon, and Pecos Bill fell out. The old man and the old woman never missed him till they got about 30 miles further on. Then they said it wasn't worth while turning back. They said they guessed the chap could take care of himself, and if he couldn't, he wasn't worth turning back for nohow. So that's how Pecos Bill come to be called Pecos Bill. What became of him? Asked Lanky. What happened to him then? What happened to him then? Said Red. That would take a long time to tell. We'll tell you about that some other time, Lanky, said Joe. End of section 6. Read by John S. Whitman. Section 7 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. Adventures of Pecos Bill. How old was Pecos Bill when he was lost on the Pecos River? Lanky asked Joe on the next night when supper was finished and the four were sitting around the fire smoking. I guess he must have been about 4-year-old, said Joe. Some says he was just a year old, but that can't be right. The old man made 2 or 3 crops down on the Trinity before the country got so thickly settled that he had to leave. What became of the family? Asked Lanky. That would be hard to answer, said Joe. Hard to answer. I don't suppose there's a soul that knows for certain. There's been tales about 'em being ate up by wild beasts, but that ain't likely. And there's been tales about 'em being killed by the Indians, but that ain't likely neither. Why, them redskins would run like scared jackrabbits when they seen the old man coming, or the old woman either. Then there's tales about 'em dying for water in the desert, which may be so, but more'n likely they settled somewheres and lived a happy and peaceful life. The chances are, said Red, that they settled in the Lost Canyon, and their offspring may be living there yet for all anybody knows. Where is the Lost Canyon? Asked Lanky. That's just what nobody don't know, said Red. But it's out in the Big Bend country somewheres, and it opens into the Rio Grande. It gets wide, and there's springs in it, and buffalo are grazing on the grass, and it's a fine country. How do you know about it? Asked Lanky. Have you ever been there? No, said Red. But people has. But you never can find it when you're looking for it. Them that finds it accidentally, and then they can't go back. That's just the place that would have suited Pecos Bill's old man, and the chances are that's where he stopped. Someday I'm going to happen on that canyon myself, and if I do, I'll just stake me out a ranch. That is, unless it's inhabited by Pecos Bill's race. If 'tis, I reckon I'll let 'em have it. And what became of Pecos Bill? Asked Lanky. Why, said Joe, he just growed up with the country. There wasn't nothing else he could do. He got to running with a bunch of coyotes and took up with 'em. He learned their language and took up all their bad habits. He could set on the ground and howl with the best of 'em, and run down a jackrabbit just as quick, too. He used to run ahead of the pack and pull down a 48-point buck and bite a hole in his neck before the rest of the coyotes got there. But he always divided with the pack, and that's probably the reason they throwed off on him like they did. Did he ever teach anybody else the coyote language? Asked Lanky. Just one old prospector that befriended him once. That was all. You see, the old man couldn't find no gold and he went to trapping, and he used the language that Bill had taught him to call up the coyotes and get 'em in his traps. Bill said it was a dirty trick, and he wouldn't teach nobody else how to speak coyote. Bill would have killed the old prospector if it hadn't been that the old man done him a favor once. What did he do? Asked Lanky. Why, it was him that found Bill and brought him back to civilization and liquor, which Bill had just about forgot the taste of. How old was Bill at that time? Asked Lanky. Oh, I guess he was about 10 years old, said Joe. One day this old prospector comes along and he hears the most terrible racket anybody ever heard of. Rocks a-rolling down the canyon, brush a-popping, and the awfulest howling and squalling you could imagine. And he looks up the canyon and sees what he first thinks is a cloud coming up, but pretty soon he discovers it's fur a-flying. Well, he decides to walk up the canyon a piece and investigate. And pretty soon he comes on Pecos Bill, who has a big grizzly bear under each arm just mortally squeezing the stuffing out of him. And while old prospector stands there a-watching, Bill tears off a hind leg and begins eating on it. A game scrap, son, says the old prospector. And who be ye? Me, says Bill. I'm a varmint. No, ye ain't a varmint, says the old prospector. You're a human. No, says Bill. I ain't no human. I'm a varmint. How come? Says the prospector. Don't I go naked? Says Bill. Sure you do, says the old prospector. Sure you're naked. So is the Indians, and them critters is part human anyway. That don't spell nothing. Don't I have fleas? Says Bill. Sure you do, says the old prospector, but all Texians has fleas. Don't I howl? Says Bill. Yeah, ye howl all right, says the old prospector, but nearly all Texians is howling most of the time. That don't spell nothing neither. Well, just the same I'm a coyote, says Bill. No, ye ain't a coyote, says the old prospector. A coyote's got a tail, ain't he? Yeah, says Bill. A coyote's got a tail. But you ain't got no tail, says the old prospector. Just feel and see if you have. Bill felt, and sure enough, he didn't have no tail. Well, I'll be danged, he says. I never did notice that before. I guess I ain't a coyote after all. Show me them humans, and if I like their looks, maybe I'll throw in with them. Well, he showed Bill the way to an outfit, and it wasn't long till he was the most famous and noted man in the whole cow country. It was him, said Hank, that invented roping. He had a rope that reached from the Rio Grande to the Big Bow, and he sure did swing a mean loop. He used to amuse himself by throwing a little julienne up in the sky and fetching down the buzzards and eagles that flew over. He roped everything he ever seen, bears and wolves and panthers, elk and buffalo. The first time he seen a train, he thought it was some kind of varmint, and damn me if he didn't sling a loop over it and dang near wreck the thing. One time his roping sure did come in handy, for he saved the life of a very dear friend. How was that? Asked Lanky. Well, Bill had a hoss that he thought the world of, and he had a good reason to, too, for he had raised him from a colt, feeding him on a special diet of nitroglycerin and barbed wire, which made him very tough and also very ornery when anybody tried to handle him but Bill. The hoss thought the world of Bill, but when anybody else come around, it was all off. He had more ways of pitching than Carter had oats. Lots of men tried to ride him, but only one man besides Bill ever mounted that hoss and lived. That's the reason Bill named him Widowmaker. Who was that man? Asked Lanky. That was Bill's friend that I was going to tell you about Bill saving his life, said Hank. You see, this feller gets his heart set on riding Widowmaker. Bill tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. He said he could ride anything that had hair. It had been his ambition from youth, he said, to find a critter that could make him pull leather. So Bill, seeing the poor feller's heart was about to break, finally told him to go ahead. He gets on Widowmaker, and that hoss begins to go through his gates, doing the end-to-end, the sunfish, and the back throw, and about that time the rider goes up in the sky. Bill watches him through a spyglass and sees him land on Pike's Peak. No doubt he would have starved to death up there, but Bill roped him by the neck and drug him down, thus saving his life. Yeah, said Red. Widowmaker was just the sort of hoss that suited Bill exactly. For one thing, it saved him a lot of shooting, because he didn't have no trouble keeping other people off his mount. And as for Bill, he could ride anything that had hair and some things that didn't have. Once, just for fun, he throwed a surcingle on a streak of lightning and rode it over Pike's Peak. Another time he bet a Stetson hat he could ride a cyclone. He went up on the Kansas line and simply eared that tornado down and got on it. Down he come across Oklahoma and the Panhandle, a-setting on that tornado, a-curling his mustache and a-spurring it in the withers. Seeing it couldn't throw him, it just naturally rained out from under him. And that's the way Bill got the only spill he ever had. Yeah, continued Red, I reckon Bill was mighty hard to throw. A smart lad he was, and a playful sort of feller, too. In his spare time he used to amuse himself putting thorns on things, bushes and cactuses and the like, and he even stuck horns on the toads, so they'd match up with the rest of the country. I see he's been at work in this country, said Lanky. Did he live all his life in Texas? Naw, he didn't, said Joe. Bill was a good deal like his old man. When he had killed all the Indians and bad men and the country got all peaceful and quiet, he just couldn't stand it any longer, and he saddled up his horse and started west. Out on the New Mexico line he met an old trapper, and they got to talking, and Bill told him why he was leaving and said if the old man knowed where there was a tough outfit, he'd be much obliged if he would tell him how to get to it. Ride up the draw about 200 miles, says the old trapper, and you'll find a bunch of guys so tough that they bite nails in two just for the fun of it. So Bill rides on in a hurry, getting somewhat reckless on account of wanting to get to that outfit and get a look at the bad hombres that the old man has told him about. The first thing Bill knowed, his hoss stumps his toe on a mountain and breaks his full neck rolling down the side, and so Bill finds himself afoot. He takes off his saddle and goes walking on, packing it till all at once he comes to a big rattlesnake. He was 12 feet long and had fangs like the tushes of a javelina, and he rears up and sings at Bill and sticks out his tongue like he was looking for a scrap. There wasn't nothing that Bill wouldn't fight, and he always fought fair. And just to be sure that rattlesnake had a fair show and couldn't claim he took advantage of him, Bill let him have 3 bites before he begun. Then he just naturally lit into that reptile and mortally flailed the stuffing out of him. Bill was always quick to forgive, though, and let bygones be bygones, and when the snake give up, Bill took him up and curled him around his neck and picked up his saddle and outfit and went on his way. As he was going along through a canyon, all at once a big mountain lion jumped off of a cliff and spraddled out all over Bill. Bill never got excited. He just took his time and laid down his saddle and his snake, and then he turned loose on that cougar. Well, sir, the hair flew so it rose up like a cloud, and the jackrabbits and roadrunners thought it was sundown. It wasn't long till that cougar had just all he could stand, and he'd begun to lick Bill's hand and cry like a kitten. Well, Bill just ears him down and slips his bridle on his head, throws on the saddle and cinches her tight, and mounts the beast. Well, that cat just tears out across the mountains and canyons, with Bill on his back, a-spurring him in the shoulders and courting him down the flank with the rattlesnake. And that's the way Bill rode into the camp of the outfit the old trapper had told him about. When he gets there, he reaches out and cheeks down the cougar and sets him on his haunches and gets down and looks at his saddle. There was them tough hombres a-setting around the fire playing Monte. There was a pot of coffee and a bucket of beans a-biling on the fire, and as Bill hadn't had nothing to eat for several days, he was hungry. So he stuck his hand down in the bucket and grabbed a handful of beans and crammed them into his mouth. Then he grabbed the coffee pot and washed them down and wiped his mouth on a prickly pear. Then he turned to the man and said, "Who in the hell is boss around here anyway?" "I was," says a big, stout feller about 7 feet tall, "but you are now, stranger." And that was the beginning of Bill's outfit. But it was only the beginning, said Red. for it wasn't long after that he staked out New Mexico and fenced Arizona for a calf pasture. He built a big ranch house and had a big yard around it. It was so far from the yard gate to the front door that he used to keep a string of saddle horses at stations along the way for the convenience of visitors. Bill always was a hospitable sort of chap, and when company come, he always tried to persuade them to stay as long as he could get 'em to. Deputy sheriffs and brand inspectors he never would let leave at all. One time his outfit was so big that he would have his cooks just dam up a draw to mix the biscuit dough in. They would dump in the flour and the salt and the baking powder and mix it up with teams and Fresnos. You can still see places where the dough was left in the bottom of the draw when they moved on. Alkali lakes, they call them. That's the baking powder that stayed in the ground. One time when there was a big drought and water got scarce on Bill's range, he lit in and dug the Rio Grande and ditched water from the Gulf of Mexico. Old man Windy Williams was water boy on the job, and he said Bill sure drove his men hard for a few days till they got through, and it kept him busy carrying water. I guess it took about all of Bill's time to manage a ranch like that, said Lanky. Not all, said Joe. That was his main vocation and calling, but he found time for a good many other things. He was always going in for something else when the cattle business got slack. When the SP come through, he got a contract furnishing 'em wood. Bill went down into Mexico and rounded up a bunch of greasers and put 'em to cutting wood. He made a contract with 'em that they was to get half the wood they cut. When the time was up, they all had big stacks of cordwood, Mexican cords, you understand, that they don't know what to do with. So Bill talked it over with 'em, and finally agreed to take it off their hands without charging 'em a cent. Bill always was liberal. He done some of the grading on the SP, too. This time he went out and rounded up 10,000 badgers and put 'em to digging. He said they was better laborers than Chinks because he could learn 'em how to work sooner. Bill had some trouble, however, getting him to go in a straight line, and that's why the SP is so crooked in places. He also got a contract fencing the right-of-way. The first thing that he done was to go out on the line of Texas and New Mexico and buy up all the dry holes old Bob Sanford had made out there trying to get water. He pulled 'em up and sawed 'em up into 2-foot lengths for post holes. I've heard that Paul Bunyan did that with dry oil wells, said Lanky. Paul Bunyan might have, for all I know, said Joe. But if he did, he learned the trick from Pecos Bill, for this was before all had been invented. However, it cost so much to freight the holes down that Bill give up the plan long before he had used up all of Bob Sanford's wells, and found a cheaper and better way of making post holes. What was his new method? Asked Lanky. Why, he just went out and rounded up a big bunch of prairie dogs and turned 'em loose where he wanted the fence, and of course every critter of 'em begun digging a hole, for it's just a prairie dog's nature to dig holes. As soon as a prairie dog would get down about 2 feet, Bill would yank him out and stick a post in the hole. Then the fool prairie dog would go start another one, and Bill would get it. Bill said he found the prairie dog labor very satisfactory. The only trouble was that sometimes during off hours, the badgers that he had grading would make a raid on the prairie dogs, and Bill would have to get up and drive them back to their own camp. Did Bill have any other occupations? Asked Lanky. Well, said Joe, he used to fight Indians just for recreation, but he never did make a business of it like some did, hunting them for $1 a scalp. In fact, Bill was not bloodthirsty and cruel, and he never scalped an Indian in his life. He'd just skin 'em and tan their hides. That reminds me, said Hank, of another business he used to carry on as a sort of sideline, and that was hunting buffalo. You see, it was the hides that was valuable, and Bill thought it was too much of a waste to kill a buffalo just for the hide, so he'd just hold the critters and skin 'em alive, and then turn 'em loose to grow a new hide. A profitable business he built up, too, but he just made one mistake. What was that? Asked Lanky. One spring he skinned too early, and a norther come up, and all the buffalo took cold and died. Mighty few of 'em left after that. Did Bill ever get married? Asked Lanky. Oh, yes, said Joe. He married lots of women in his day, but he never had the real tender affection for any of the rest of 'em that he had for his first wife, Slewfoot Sue. Bill savvied courtin' ladies all right, and he never took much stock in petticoats till he met Slewfoot Sue. But when he saw that gal come riding down the Rio Grande on a catfish, it just got next to him, and he married her right off. I say right off, but she made him wait a few days till she could send to San Antonio for a suitable and proper outfit. The principal garment being a big steel wire bustle, like all the women wore when they dressed up in them days. Well, everything would have gone off fine, but on the very day of the wedding, Sue took a full notion into her head that she just had to ride Widowmaker. For a long time Bill wouldn't hear to it, but finally she begun to cry and said Bill didn't love her any more. Bill just couldn't stand to see her cry, so he told her to go ahead but to be careful. Well, she got on that hoss, and he give about 2 jumps, and she left the saddle. He throwed her so high that she had to duck as she went up to keep from bumping her head on the moon. Then she come down, landing right on that steel bustle, and that made her bounce up just as high, nearly, as she had went before. Well, she just kept on bouncing like that for 10 days and nights, and finally Bill had to shoot her to keep her from starving to death. It nearly broke his heart. That was the only time Bill had ever been known to shed tears, and he was so tore up that he wouldn't have nothing to do with the woman for 2 weeks. End of section 7, read by John S. Whitman. Section 8 of Tall Tales from Texas. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright. The Exodus of Pecos Bill. Lanky had been sent for, and this was his last night in camp. His face was tanned, he had gained in weight, he had earned money in his own right. He felt that he was now a man. He and his cronies sat around the fire in silence. Joe and the boys would miss the kid, and he hated to leave. This silence wouldn't do. "What became of Pecos Bill?" asked Lanky. "That would be hard to say," said Joe. "Hard to say. Everybody knows he's gone, just like the open range and the longhorn steer, but just how and where he passed in his checks, I don't suppose anybody will ever find out for certain. A lot of the fellers that knowed him are dead, and a lot of 'em has bad memories. A lot of the old-timers has bad memories. And some of 'em are such damn liars that you can't go by what they say." "You've seen Pecos Bill, haven't you, Joe?" said Lanky. "Well, yes, that is, I seen him when I was a young buck, but I never seen him die, and I never could find out just how he was took off. I've seen some mighty hot arguments on the subject, and I've knowed 1 or 2 fellers to die with their boots on after getting in a quarrel in just that way." "I heard one account a few years ago," said Red, "that may be right. There was a feller in Amarillo named Gabriel Asbury Jackson. He'd worked himself out of a job in Kansas and had come to Texas to buck the cigarette evil. One time he cornered a bunch of us that was too drunk to make a getaway and begun talking to us about smoking. 'Young men,' he says, 'beware of cigarettes. You think you're smart to smoke a sack of Bull Durham every day, do you? Well, look at Pecos Bill. A stalwart young man he was, tough as nails, a fine specimen. But he got to fooling with cigarettes. What did they do for him?' he says. 'Why, nothing at first. But did he quit? No,' he says. 'He puffed away for 90 years, but they finally got him. And they'll get you, every mother's son of you, if you don't leave 'em alone.' 'That ain't so,' said Joe. 'That man was just a liar. Cigarettes never killed Pecos Bill. He was, however, a great smoker, but he never smoked Bull Durham. He made him up a mixture of his own, the principal ingredients being Kentucky homespun, sulphur, and gunpowder. Why, he would have thought he was a sissy if he'd smoked Bull Durham. When the matches was scarce, Bill used to ride out into a thunderstorm and light his cigarette with a streak of lightning, and that's no doubt what's back of a tale you hear every once in a while about him being struck and killed. But nobody that knows how Bill throwed a surcingle over a streak of lightning and rode it over Pike's Peak will ever believe that story. I heard it was liquor that killed poor Bill, said Hank. Must have been bootleg, said Red. No, said Hank. You see, Bill being brought up as he was from tender youth on whiskey and onions, he was still a young man when whiskey lost its kick for him. He got to putting nitroglycerin in his drinks. That worked all right for a while, but soon he had to go to wolf bait, and when that got so it didn't work, he went to fish hooks. Bill used to say, rather sorrowful like, that was the only way he could get an idea from his booze. But after about 50 years, the fish hooks rusted out his interior parts and brought poor Bill to an early grave. I don't know who told you that, Windy, said Joe. It might have been your own daddy, but it ain't so. It's just another damn lie concocted by them damn prohibition men. I heard another tale, said Red, which may be right for all I know. I heard that Bill went to Fort Worth one time, and there he seen a Boston man who had just come to Texas with a mail-order cowboy outfit on. And when Bill seen him, he just naturally laid down and laughed himself to death. That may be so, said Joe, but I doubt it. I heard one tale about the death of Pecos Bill that I believe is the real, correct, and true account. And what was that? Asked Lanky. Well, Bill happened to drift into Cheyenne just as the first rodeo was being put on. Being a bit curious to know what it was all about, he went out to the grounds to look the thing over. When he seen the ropers and the riders, he begun to weep, the first tears he'd shed since the death of Slewfoot Sue. Well, finally, when a country lawyer just 3 years out of Mississippi got up to make a speech and referred to the men on horseback as cowboys, Bill turned white and begun to tremble. And then when the country lawyer went on to talk about keeping inviolate the sacred traditions of the Old West, Bill just went out and crawled in a prairie dog hole and died of solemncholy. Lanky looked at Red and Hank. They had not missed the point, but they chose to ignore it. Joe talked on. After several years, he said, when all Bill's would-be rivals was sure he was dead, they all begun to try to ruin his reputation and defame his character. They said he was a hot-headed, overbearing sort of feller. They was too scared to use the word, even after Bill died, but what they meant was that he was a killer. Now, Pecos Bill did kill lots of men. He never kept no tally hisself, and I don't suppose nobody will ever know just how many he took off. Of course, I'm not referring to Mexicans and Indians. Bill didn't count them, but Bill wasn't a bad man, and he hardly ever killed a man without just cause. For instance, there was Big Ike that he shot for snoring, that Bill's enemies talked up so much. But then that was doing the talking would forget to mention that Bill had been standing guard over Mexico's steers every night for 6 weeks and was getting a bit sleepy. Then there was Risbone. Riss was one of these practical jokers, and he ramrodded an outfit that fell in behind Bill's on the trail. Riss had a dozen or so jokes, and when he pulled one, he slapped his knees and laughed, whether anybody else was a-laughing or not. One day Riss rode up to Bill's chuck wagon when there wasn't nobody there but the cook, and he was asleep in the shade of the wagon with his head between the wheels. Riss slipped up and grabbed trace chains and begun rattling them and yelling, "Whoa! Whoa!" The poor spick woke up thinking that the team was running away and that he was about to get his pass to St. Peter. He jumped up and bumped his head on the wagon. Then he wakes up and looks around, and there stands Riss, slapping his knees and laughing. Just then Bill rides up, but he never said nothing. When the outfits got to Abilene, Bill was in the White Elephant with some of his men fixing to take a drink. Just as Bill was about to drop his fish hooks in his glass, Riss poked his head in at the window and yelled, "Fire! Fire!" And Bill did. In one killing, however, Bill acted a bit hasty, as he admitted himself. One day he called Three-Fingered Ed out of the saloon, saying he'd like to speak with him in private. Bill led Ed out into a back alley, and there they stopped. "Say, Ed," he says, looking him right in the eye, Didn't you say that Mike said I was a hot-headed, overbearing sort of feller? Naw, says Ed. You mistook me. He never said that. Well, doggone, says Bill. Ain't that too bad? I've gone and killed an innocent man. Well, Lanky, maybe your pa'll let you come back next fall. The End. End of Tall Tales from Texas by Mody Coggin Boatright.